Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all members set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation.
Announcements by the Vice President.
Honorable Senators, I wish to advise that the President of the Senate, Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, is currently acting as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Hazel Thompson IE, who is out of the country. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the President, Paula May Weeks, ORTT. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, ORTT, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Mr. Ndali Young, whereas Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo is incapable of performing her duties as a President of the Senate by reason of her acting as the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Vice President of the Senate is required to perform the duties of the President of the Senate. As a result, a vacancy has arisen in the Senate. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Ndali Young, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 23rd of October 2019 and continuing during the period that Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo will be acting as President of Trinidad and Tobago, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 22nd day of October 2019. To Mr. Josh O. W. Drayton, whereas Senator Hazel Thompson IE is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Josh O. W. Drayton, to be a member of the Senate temporarily with effect from the 23rd of October 2019 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of Senator Hazel Thompson IE, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 22nd day of October 2019. Honorable Senators, Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Ndali Young, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities of the peoples of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Josh Drayton, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives on the supplemental order paper, the Appropriation Financial Year 2020 Bill 2019.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, in accordance with the Standing Order 62(1)B, I beg to move that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The next stage of the bill will be taken later in the proceedings.
Papers.
The Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in my name. The Civil Aviation Number 1, General Application and Personnel Licensing Amendment Regulation 2019. The Civil Aviation Number 2, Operations Amendment Regulation 2019. The Civil Aviation Number 3, Air Operator Certification and Administration Amendment Regulations 2019. The Civil Aviation Number 5, Airworthiness Amendment Regulations 2019. The Civil Aviation Number 6, Approved Maintenance Organization Amendment Regulation 2019. And the Civil Aviation Number 7, Instrument and Equipment Amendment Regulations 2019. I thank you.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Princestown Regional Corporation Chairman's Fund for the year ended September 30, 2018. The draft estimates of expenditure for the financial year 2020. The draft estimates, details of estimates of recurrent expenditure for the financial year 2020. The draft estimates of revenue and expenditure of the statutory boards and similar bodies and of the Tobago House of Assembly for the financial year 2020. The draft estimates of the development program for the financial year 2020. The draft estimates of the revenue for the financial year 2020. The Social Sector Investment Program 2020. The Public Sector Investment Program Trinidad 2020, the Public Sector Investment Program Tobago 2020, the State Enterprises Investment Program 2020, the Review of the Economy 2019, and the Vision 2030 Achievement Report 2018 to 2019. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the name of the Attorney General. The Administration of Justice Indictable Proceedings Amendment to Schedule 6, Order 2019, and the Family Proceedings Amendment Rules 2019.
Introduction of bills. The Bail Amendment Number 2 Bill 2019 in the name of the Attorney General. Public Business, Government Business Bills, second reading.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Service of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ending on the 30th day of September 2020 be now read a second time. Mr. Vice President, in 2015, under the esteemed and astute leadership of our Prime Minister, the Honorable Dr. Keith Rowley, the People's National Movement Administration assumed office. The opening lines, Mr. Vice President, from W.B. Yeats' famous poem, The Second Coming, puts it best in terms of what we met. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Mr. Vice President, immediately we set out to repair the fragmented economy we inherited from 5 years of mismanagement by the previous administration, and we began rebuilding systems of credibility and trust in our quest to deliver proper governance to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. When this PNW administration took office in 2015, we met an economy in serious distress. Alarming high levels of expenditure that peaked historically in fiscal 2014 at $63 billion, projects that bore relatively reduced economic benefits, and a cash position that impacted the country's operations are just some of the issues that we had to contend with. We set out to bring stability to the economy by putting in place a sequenced program of internal adjustment measures designed to alter the deteriorated revenue position we had inherited. We had to self-adjust, otherwise the burgeoning asymmetry between revenue and expenditure could have forced us to approach multilateral agencies such as the IMF, a scenario that some of our regional and indeed global partners have not escaped. My presentation today, Mr. Vice President, is focused as follows. 1, on the economy we inherited. 2, the steps we undertook to reverse the economic decline. 3, the outturn for fiscal 2019 and the macroeconomic outlook. 4, the major institutional and infrastructural projects designed to support our revenue potential and engineer economic growth. 5, fiscal measures that will set the stage for further growth and development. And 6, the budget finances. Mr. Vice President, earlier I had mentioned the distortion in revenues and expenditure, but just how did this asymmetry begin? Our fiscal revenues, to a large extent, have conventionally been based on the global commodity energy prices. In 2014, expenditure peaked historically at $63 billion, and oil prices were hovering at $93 per barrel. Mr. Vice President, we also know historically that commodity prices are volatile and that the possibility existed in 2014 that prices could have fallen, but instead of managing expenditure in a prudent manner, the then UNC administration put this country on an unsustainable path. Between 2010 and 2014, oil revenue averaged around 29% of total revenue. Following the collapse of oil prices in 2014, this percentage declined to 18.4% in 2015, and by 2017, this further declined to an astonishing 1.2% of total revenue. Similarly, in 2014, total petroleum taxes peaked at $16.9 billion and fell to $1.1 billion in 2017. The steps that we took to reverse the economic decline. In fiscal 2016, Mr. Vice President, when we assumed office, we managed to bring down expenditure to a sustainable level of around $53 billion, or an almost 16% reduction of what was recognized in 2014. The efficiency gain continues through an expenditure of $50.5 billion in 2019, or a 20% reduction. Indeed, this has been no easy feat and bears testimony to the efforts of the Rowley administration. These adjustments in expenditure were necessary to give this country the breathing room to maintain essential operations. Even with these constraints, we sought to buffer the impact of the depressed economic circumstances on the general population, especially the most vulnerable among us. And indeed, as I would have identified in my mid-year presentation, some of the fiscal measures which were instituted to protect this group. Mr. Vice President, as a whole, we have been able to bring expenditure to a realistic $48.8 billion in 2018 and $50.5 billion in 2019, a substantial reduction from the 2014 peak of $63 billion. In the 2019 fiscal year, we have been able to estimate revenue at $46.5 billion, with a fiscal deficit of $3.9 billion, or 2.5% of GDP. We remain committed to our resolve to reverse the impairments to our fiscal accounts with both targeted revenue-raising measures and efficient expenditure so as not to adversely impact our nation's citizens. The global macroeconomy. Mr. Vice President, the global economy continues to impact us, in particular commodity energy prices. Risk and uncertainty worldwide through US-China trade tensions, Brexit uncertainty, and rising geopolitical tensions have been keeping energy prices in a volatile state. The World Bank, in its June 2019 Global Economic Prospects, estimated softer global growth in 2018, that is 3%, from an original projection of 3.8%. The downward revision has continued in 2019 with an estimate of 2.6% growth. The World Bank is estimating that global growth will pick up slowly by 2021 to 2.8%. In short, Mr. Vice President, the global growth projections will continue to impact domestic economic conditions, and this PNM administration will continue to monitor, evaluate, and adapt to these scenarios as in our quest to safeguard the interests of our citizens. The domestic economy. The Central Statistical Office is now estimating flat growth for 2018, with the economy stabilizing in the second half of the year. Notwithstanding this, growth estimates for the first quarter of 2019 show a rebound in the economy of 1.7%. Mr. Vice President, what this points to is an economy in recovery, from negative growth rates of minus 6.3% in 2016 and minus 2.3% in 2017 to positive growth in 2019. This is indeed a significant milestone for the country's recovery efforts. It has been the result of a deliberate program of adjustment to link expenditure to this country's revenue potential. Our sequenced program of curtailing unproductive spending and pushing the envelope on improvements in the operational efficiency of the public sector is the main facet of this adjustment. We have now determined that through a managed adjustment program, expenditure and revenue estimates should be in the range of $50 to $53 billion. Mr. Vice President, I now turn to the outturn for 2019. We began the year with an oil price assumption of $65 per barrel US and a gas price of US 2.75 MMBTU, with budgeted revenue of $47.72 billion and $51.77 billion in expenditure, supported by deficit spending of deficit financing of $4.05 billion, or 2.4% of GDP. In the May mid-year review 2019, these figures were adjusted to $52.07 billion in expenditure and $47.5 billion in revenue, with a resultant overall fiscal deficit of $4.57 billion, or 2.85% of GDP. The revised estimates for 2019 indicate $50.5 billion of expenditure and $46.56 billion for revenue, with the fiscal deficit being $3.94 billion, or 2.38% of GDP, compared to the deficit of $4.57 billion, or 2.85% of GDP that was projected at the mid-year. These improvements to the fiscal account are in no way a finished product. We continue to place emphasis on the removal of the dire straits the UNC administration left us in. Mr. Vice President, we have provided the environment for solid growth to drive investment further. This environment includes exchange rate stability, low and stable interest rates, stabilization of public sector debt levels within internationally recognized benchmarks, increase in the value of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, with the net asset value of the fund now at $6.25 billion, or $600 million more than it was in September 2015. The total of our foreign reserves and assets in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund remain very substantial at $13.25 billion at the end of September 2019. Maintenance of positive credit ratings by the international rating agencies, ensuring that the economy remains attractive to investors. Low and stable inflation rates. The medium-term outlook. Mr. Vice President, using the latest World Bank estimate, we are projecting GDP for 2019 to be 0.9%. Moreover, in the medium-term growth estimates are forecasted for 2020, 2021, and 2022 at 1.9%, 4.1%, and 3.6% respectively. These projections are tied to an improving global economic environment and an expansion in the production of oil and gas. Energy revenues are projected to increase incrementally during the forecast period from $16.23 billion in 2020 to $19.53 billion in 2022, with the increase being driven by modest increases in oil and gas prices and a greater degree of clarity and certainty in energy agreements with the upstreamers and downstreamers, with the associated production uptakes. We are also predicting improvements in the non-energy sector. Major institutional and infrastructural projects. Mr. Vice President, permit me to share with the Senate the status of our work with respect to our major projects. The Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority. Mr. Vice President, the overall tax gap has been conservatively estimated to be in the vicinity of approximately $5 billion per year, or approximately 10% of public revenue. The policy framework informing the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority bill, which will soon be relayed in Parliament, is consistent with the Revenue Authority model, which is geared towards improving taxpayer compliance and minimizing the tax gap. Mr. Vice President, the enabling Revenue Authority legislation has already been subject to a report by a Joint Select Committee, and this administration expects that with the required majority Parliament support, the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority will become a reality and fully operational in fiscal 2020. Gambling, gaming and betting. Mr. Vice President, having completed the examination of a gambling, gaming and betting bill in a Joint Select Committee of Parliament, all that is left to be done is a review by our international consultants of the regulations and final examination of same by the Joint Select Committee to allow passage and implementation of the new legislation. This review is almost complete, and we expect, with bipartisan parliamentary support, that the proposed Gambling Control Commission could be established within the next 3 to 6 months, thereby bringing to an end a largely unregulated gambling sector. Property tax. Mr. Vice President, we have been building the infrastructure to inform the implementation of the property tax 2009 as amended. We continue to build capacity in the Valuation Division of the Ministry of Finance, and trained assessors are now in the field generating a valuation role. Mr. Vice President, we at the Ministry of Finance will continue to work assiduously to accelerate this process with recently recruited additional field assessors to achieve, as soon as we can, the 50% target of assessed properties for the commencement of residential property taxation. Procurement. Mr. Vice President, the Office of the Procurement Regulator is now fully staffed with the establishment of a comprehensive database on public procurement, including information on tenders received and the award and value of contracts. Procuring units across the state sector will soon be provided with guidance handbooks. Discussions and consultations with the Office of the Procurement Regulator have continued through 2019, and the procurement regulations are soon to be laid in Parliament. CL Financial and CLICO. Mr. Vice President, as a result of decisive intervention by this government, CLICO has now settled approximately $15 billion of its debt to taxpayers. This includes the funds which will be received from the sale of the traditional portfolio. This excludes those proceeds. We are now in the process of analyzing the remaining debt to be repaid by CLICO and CL Financial. The National Investment Fund. Mr. Vice President, the National Investment Fund is a significant achievement of this PNM government, giving back to taxpayers, as we promised, significant returns on public funds used in the bailout of CLICO. We continue to use this vehicle as a mechanism for monetizing. We will continue to use this vehicle as a mechanism for monetizing major state assets, including those assets transferred to the government for repayment of the cost of the CL Financial CLICO bailout. We are addressing the issue of the outstanding VAT returns that is necessary to supplement businesses' cash flows, and this is further explained in the fiscal measures section of my presentation. Development projects. Mr. Vice President, I would now like to share with this Honourable Senate and the national community some of our notable projects. These projects, in keeping with our development philosophy, are designed as investment in our future to promote sustained economic and social development. The projects will develop infrastructure that will support and improve quality of life for the national community and increase productivity. In addition, all of these projects will create employment with the resulting multiplier effect during construction, and in many cases will generate significant employment in the medium and long term. The San Fernando-Point Fortin Highway. The 35-kilometer Solomon-Hochoy Highway to Point Fortin project is scheduled to be completed at the end of 2020. This long-awaited highway, on which $5.1 billion had been originally spent by the previous government on land acquisition, utility relocation, construction and supervision, will now be completed at a further cost of $2.3 billion. When completed, the highway with appropriate interchanges will traverse the southwestern areas of Trinidad, providing connectivity to several major communities from San Fernando to Point Fortin, including Dumfries and Mont Desir, a segment from Mont Desir to Point Fortin via Le Bray, and a connection from Mont Desir back to Faizabad. Valencia-Toco roadway. The 40-kilometer Valencia to Toco roadway upgrade is now under construction. When completed, it will vastly improve access to the entire eastern seaboard of Trinidad, bringing business opportunities, including residential and tourism investments and prosperity, to the communities of Valencia, Sangre Grande, Matura, Salibia, Rampanalgas, Cumana, San Souci, Toco, Grand River, and Matlot. We are advancing this project in phases with completion targeted for 2021. The Churchill-Roosevelt Highway extension to Manzanilla. Mr. Vice President, the 33-kilometer Churchill-Roosevelt Highway extension to Manzanilla is also under construction. The project, like the Valencia-Toco roadway, will open up East Trinidad to increase economic and social development. Presently an underserved area with great potential, encouraging and stimulating agriculture, tourism, and other growth areas in Kumuto, Manzanilla, Sangre Grande, and Mayaro to Guayagari. The QREP interchange. Mr. Vice President, the Curup interchange is being constructed at a cost of $221.6 million. We envisage full commissioning of this important project by March 2020. All motorists proceeding along the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway, both eastbound and westbound in the vicinity of North and South Balsane, Curup, and St. Augustine, will now experience significantly less traffic congestion with the removal of traffic lights at Val Park, Balsane, and the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway Southern Main Road intersection. The San Fernando waterfront. Mr. Vice President, the San Fernando waterfront project, upon completion at a cost of $1 billion, will become the commercial core of the city of San Fernando, with increased opportunities for income-generating activities as well as improved living conditions. Coastal protection. Coastal protection work in several areas are establishing coastal communities as models of sustainable development. At Quinam, the beach was reopened to the public in December 2018. At Manzanilla, the Cocos-based stabilization works are at an advanced stage of completion, and so is the Sans Souci shoreline. The Capdeville shoreline will be completed in 2020. The construction of the breakwater Magdalena Grand Golf and Beach Resort is expected to be completed, as well as the Maplot Grand Riviere works. The Moruga Agro-Processing and Light Industrial Estate will be commissioned before the end of this year. We are in the process of tenanting the park, having already identified 10 potential investors interested in processing fruits and vegetables. We are establishing this Moruga facility as a catalyst for expanding the agricultural sector and for generating exports of competitive agro-products. The Toco Port will facilitate a faster alternative sea route between Tobago and East Trinidad. This will accommodate safe berthing for the fishing vessels of fisherfolk in that area and improve maritime security. The environmental requirements are now being addressed, and this is paving the way for the award of a design-build contract in 2020 at a total cost of $750 million. The Toco Port should be completed in 2022. The Moruga Fishing Port, Mr. Vice President, is a new modern fishing port with its berthing and landing facilities. This project is in the environmental certification stage, with construction of the marine facility scheduled to begin in 2020. The lives of the citizens of Moruga will be significantly improved, bearing in mind that a large portion of that population depends on the fishing industry for their livelihood. Healthcare infrastructure works. We continue our efforts in healthcare and healthcare infrastructural works as follows. The Arima Hospital is to be commissioned before the end of 2019. The Point Fortin Hospital with 100 beds will be commissioned in January 2020. Construction of the new Sangre Grande Hospital with 100 beds has started, with a completion date scheduled for November 2021. The Port of Spain Hospital Central Block, now in design development, will provide 540 beds when completed in January 2022. The Couva Medical and Multi-Training Facility is a 230-bed hospital. The hospital will provide its services on a sequence basis, initially with referred services for patient medication, therapy management, and diagnostic testing. The Roxborough Hospital, Mr. Vice President, will be a fully functional medical facility with commissioning scheduled for 2021. The energy sector. Mr. Vice President, it would be remiss of me to not outline our successful developments with respect to the Petroleum Company of Trinidad and Tobago, Petrotrin. The Heritage Petroleum Company Limited, a new exploration and production company, has already achieved profitability and is contributing to public revenue. The company has succeeded in achieving growth in its quarterly production levels, both offshore and on land, and has generated revenues of $3.287 billion in the first 3 quarters of operation, leading the company to register a net profit of $543.5 million. The company is expected to ramp up production from a projected annual average of 35 barrels per day in 2019 to just over 40,000 barrels per day by 2020. The company has increased production from 31,000 barrels in December 2018 to 33.5 thousand in June of 2019. Mr. Vice President, the Guayakara Refining Company Limited, into which the refining assets of Petrotrin were placed, is now in an advanced sale process with a broad-based evaluation team now negotiating with the preferred bidder, the Patriotic Energies and Technologies Company Limited, a company which is wholly owned by the Oilfield Workers Trade Union. These discussions are proceeding, UNC vacillations on this matter notwithstanding. The benefits of the restart of the refinery for the communities of Marabella, Pointe-a-Pierre, San Fernando, and Gasparillo are obvious, and we are comforted at the expected economic realization of these fence-line communities. Mr. Vice President, Tobago. We continue to support the development of all economic sectors in Tobago. We are seeking to gain a competitive edge in the tourism sector, and to this end, the government is currently in discussions with Apple Leisure Group, a first-class, vertically integrated travel and hospitality conglomerate, to manage and operate the Magdalena Grand Beach and Golf Resort. Completion of the Roxborough Administrative Complex and the rehabilitation of the Claude Noel Highway will enhance the tourism envelope for Tobago. We will continue to work with the Tobago House of Assembly on the construction of the new A&R Robinson International Airport Terminal. The Sea Bridge now has in operation the Jean de la Villette, a newly leased ferry which has joined the Galleon's Passage, the TT Spirit, and the Cabo Star in the service of the Sea Bridge. 2 brand new state-of-the-art fast ferries are expected to arrive in mid-2020 to further enhance that service. For fiscal 2020, the budgetary allocation to the Tobago House of Assembly is $2.283 billion, $2.033 billion of which is allocated for recurrent expenditure and $231.6 million for capital expenditure. 18 million is allocated for the unemployment relief program in Tobago. This allocation to the THA represents 4.3% of the national budget and is consistent with the recommendations of the Dispute Resolution Commission. The Minister of Finance has granted approval to the THE to utilize bond financing in the amount of $300 million to fund critical development projects in Tobago based on the creditworthiness of the Tobago House of Assembly. It should also be noted that in addition to the above, an additional approximate $1 billion is allocated through various ministries and statutory bodies to be spent in Tobago. Fiscal 2020 estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Vice President, we continue to be mindful of the challenging macro-fiscal environment influenced by external and sometimes volatile movements in commodity prices, and will rationalize expenditure accordingly in broad alignment with Vision 2020 agenda. Our budgeted revenue for 2020 is projected on the same oil and gas price assumptions established in the mid-year budget review. That is an oil price of US $60 and a gas price of US $3 per MMBTU. Accordingly, total revenue has been budgeted at $47.749 billion, up from the $46.559 billion, an increase of $1.19 billion for the estimated revised outturn for 2019. Total expenditure for 2020 has been budgeted at $53.036 billion, an increase of $2.53 billion over the fiscal 2019 outturn of $50.5 billion, but significantly below the peak expenditure of $62.8 billion achieved in 2014. The fiscal deficit of 2020 is expected to increase marginally to $5.287 billion, or 3.1% of gross domestic product, to a fiscal deficit of $3.947 billion, or 2.4% of GDP in fiscal 2019, which is lower than the originally projected deficit of $4.05 billion in 2019. Mr. President, based on these assumptions, we are projecting for 2020 total revenue of 47.749 billion, of which oil revenue will total 11 billion, non-oil revenue 35.795 billion, and capital revenue of 0.950 billion. Total expenditure, net of capital repayments and sinking fund of 53.36 billion and a fiscal deficit of 5.287 billion. The major fiscal 2020 allocations will be as follows. Education, 7.548 billion, national security, 6.44 billion, health, 6.084 billion, public utilities, 3.047 billion, works and transport, 2.956 billion, rural development and local government, 2.469 billion, housing, 1 billion, agriculture, 0.708 billion. We will raise domestic financing on the capital market in a net amount equivalent to 3.811 billion and external financing in a net amount of 1.476 billion. Fiscal and other measures, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the following key fiscal measures form the basis of strategic interventions required for the achievement of the government's objective under Vision 2030. Life insurance companies, taxation reform. Mr. Vice President, we have recently reformed the legislation under which life insurance companies operate, and we have now completed the technical work relating to the taxation of life insurance companies in light of the provision in the Insurance Act 2018 that the statutory fund be eliminated. With the statutory fund no longer available as a tax basis, a new methodology is proposed to replace the existing basis for taxation of life insurance companies. The new methodology will have minimal marginal impact on the tax position of insurance companies and will be easily implementable. This measure will require amendments to the Corporation Tax Act. Life certificates for pensioners. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to eliminate in the first instance the requirement for life certificates for the category of government pensioners who were born in Trinidad and Tobago and possess their computerized birth certificates and associated personal identification numbers. This measure will be subsequently extended to include recipients of senior citizens' pensions. I wish to point out that the total elimination of life certificates is not possible at this time, as the new system involves the matching of personal identification numbers from the Trinidad and Tobago National Computerized Birth Certificate System to the Trinidad and Tobago Registry of Deaths. Immigration and Customs Arrival Forms. Mr. Vice President, in an effort to keep up with international best practice and the ever-changing world of technology, we propose to eliminate immigration and customs arrival forms at our airports. The new system will rely on advanced passenger information using machine-readable passports and other appropriate technology. This initiative will significantly reduce the lengthy lines at our airports, as it is aimed to improve the efficiencies at immigration and customs. This new policy will take effect in 2020. Light bulbs tariff structure. Mr. Vice President, in order to support the transition to LED lighting, the government proposes to remove all taxes and duties on LED bulbs and appurtenances. Solar water heating equipment. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to increase the solar water heating equipment tax credit from 25% to 100% of the cost of solar water heating equipment, up to a maximum of $10,000. This initiative will benefit approximately 12,000 households, well said, and will take effect from January 1, 2020. Energy exploration and development. Mr. Vice President, the capital allowance for energy companies involved in exploration and development is currently 50% for the first year, 30% for the second year, and 20% for the third year. We propose to provide a capital allowance for exploration and development for both tangible and intangible expenditure to be computed on a straight line basis over 5 years. That is 20% per year. This measure will result in significant additional revenue for the government and will take effect on January 1, 2020. Energy loss relief. Mr. Vice President, in order to increase our revenue derived from our natural resources from companies engaged in the oil and gas exploration and development, the government proposes a reduction in the loss relief rate from 100% to 75% of taxable profit. This measure will take effect on January 1, 2020. Investment tax credit. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to increase the investment tax credit for energy companies from 20% to 25% to stimulate further exploration and development-related investments in the energy sector. This increase will give companies the ability to claim 25% of the expenditure on development activity for mature fields and enhanced oil recovery projects as a credit against their supplemental petroleum tax liability. This measure will take effect on January 1, 2020. On-the-job training. Madam President, the government proposes to increase the OJT program stipends by 10% and to increase the intake for the program to 8,000 trainees. This measure will take effect on December 1, 2019. The minimum wage. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to increase the minimum wage from $15 to $17.50 per hour. This measure will benefit approximately 194,000 persons in the workforce and will take effect from December 1, 2019. The personal allowance at airports. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to increase the value of personal goods which can be imported without incurring customs duty from $3,000, which was set in 2005, to $5,000. This measure will take effect from January 1, 2020. The creative industries. The government proposes to increase the tax allowance from $3 million to $6 million for the corporate sponsorship of nationals in the local fashion industry, audio, visual, and video productions for the purpose of local education or local entertainment and local production companies in respect of their own productions, as well as for companies which sponsor sporting activities or events or sportsmen and art and culture. This measure will take effect from January 1, 2020. Public service pension. Mr. Vice President, public service pensions were reformed in 2019, with public servants immediately upon retirement receiving $3,500 per month. A total of 15,000 public servants are now benefiting from this reform. The government now proposes to review public service pensions with a view to indexing these pensions at an appropriate level. This review will be completed in fiscal 2020. Cooperative societies. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to amend the Cooperative Societies Act to increase the current limit of $5,000 imposed on the transfer of shares or interest payable to a nominated beneficiary upon the death of a member to $50,000. This measure will take effect from January 1, 2020. We also propose to take steps to put in place the appropriate machinery to provide for the payment of utility bills by cooperative societies and credit unions. In addition, after extensive discussions with the credit union movement, we propose to create a new independent authority to govern the cooperative sector. This new entity will be the regulator of cooperatives and will report to the Ministry of Finance. After the new entity is established, financial credit unions will be able to offer certain types of banking or quasi-banking services, such as encashment of checks and teller services. The Deposit Insurance Corporation will be required to maintain a fund to meet any emerging liabilities of the sector. CPEP. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to increase the wages of CPAP workers by 15% and also to increase the fees paid to CPAP contractors by 15%. These measures will take effect on December 1, 2019. Unemployment Relief Program. The government also proposes to increase the wages of URP workers by 15%. This measure will take effect on December 1st, 2019. Daily paid public servants. Mr. Vice President, presently, when a daily paid worker in the public service retires, a lump sum of money is received, but no pension. The government proposes that daily paid workers in the public sector with appropriate minimum length of service will be eligible for a pension consistent with the minimum public service pension of $3,500 a month.
Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. This will be a contributory pension plan similar to the contributory health plan already in force for public sector workers. Further details of this measure will be given in the Finance Act of 2019, and the new pension plan for daily paid workers will take effect in 2020. Stereotypes and plastics. Mr. Vice President, in our pursuit to attain our stated goal of placing the environment at the center of national development, the government proposes to eliminate the use of styrofoam and single-use plastics within the national economy. As an initial step, the government proposes to ban the importation of styrofoam for use in the food service industry and to require manufacturers of food containers to introduce additives to make their products biodegradable. In order to encourage behavioral change, we propose to terminate the use of plastic water bottles in government offices and substitute them with coolers with filters. This measure will take effect on January 1, 2020. And Mr. Vice President, may I compliment the Parliament in leading the way in this matter. CARICOM market, agriculture incentive structure. Mr. Vice President, to further stimulate domestic agriculture, the government proposes to remove all taxes and all duties on imports and resources for farmers registered for agricultural purposes and to make agriculture in all its facets, including processing of local agricultural products, a tax-free industry. Mr. Vice President, the government proposes to put in place an appropriate framework within the value-added tax, within which the value-added tax was originally established, to allow for the refund of VAT on a current and consistent basis. For this purpose, the government proposes to offer $3 billion in the first instance in interest-bearing government bonds to all eligible VAT-registered businesses to meet VAT arrears. The new VAT bonds will have a tenure of 5 years and bear interest at the rate of 1.5% per annum. Further details of this incentive will be provided in the Finance Act in December 2019. In closing, Mr. Vice President, the 2020 budget appropriately themed stability, strength and growth signals that we have reversed the economic uncertainty that we met in 2015 and are now on a track to steady and sustainable growth. We are ever mindful of the global economic factors impinging on our domestic economy, and we will take this into account in treating with economic policy. Mr. Vice President, Oprah Winfrey, perhaps the most successful African-American female entrepreneur, said, "The key to realizing a dream is to focus not on success, but on significance. And then even the small steps and the little victories along your path will take on greater meaning."
Well said, well said.
This, Mr. Vice President, resounds throughout the life and breadth of this PNM administration. We do our work quietly, but remain results-oriented, steadfast in our determination as we continue to press on for the good of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, I thank you and I beg.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Service of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ending on the 30th day of September 2020 be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. Vice President, it is now well established and accepted that the real budget was presented by this country's next Prime Minister, the Honorable Kamala Bissessa, on Friday, the 11th of October, 2019. What we have been presented with this morning is a disconnected, disorganized, wishy-washy set of proposals with no vision, no direction, Mr. Vice President, no plan to get our economy and country working again. UNC works, the PNM talks. Mr. Vice President, our country and its citizens are locked in mortal combat and daily struggle in confronting, combating, and we will be ultimately defeating this Rowley curse, which like a bolt of lightning has descended upon this nation. Mr. Vice President, after 4 years of PNM deception, empty promises, crushing austerity, unprecedented and sophisticated corruption, this country is today worse off than it was under a progressive UNC-led administration. Mr. Vice President, a fundamental and major paradigm shift is absolutely essential if this country is to be saved from virtual barbarity under this administration. A new path and direction is urgently required if this country is to change course. This country, under this administration, the PNM, is heading in the wrong direction. I would like, Mr. Vice President, to share with you a very powerful quotation, unforgettable words from one Maya Angelou. I want to quote, Mr. Vice President, "People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." I want that quote to sink into the heads of every single voter when they head to the voting booths on the 2nd of December. Mr. Vice President, after a season of suffering, brutality, terror, and austerity, the ruling elite, represented by this neo-colonial, Rowley-led PNM administration, has now decided to offer crumbs falling off from the master's table to a battered, bruised, and mentally scarred population. Mr. Vice President, the new colonizers of our country have offered to increase, as we are told, the minimum wage by $2.50. Provide what? A 15% increase in wages to CPAP workers, yet still the allocation is the same. And also, Mr. Vice President, offer the same 15% to the URP workers. They have offered a stipend, 10% increase to the OJT. It is a promise, Mr. Vice President. They have also promised to address a new pension plan for thousands of daily rated workers, as well as to promote the indexation of pensions of public officers to the cost of living. These things will not happen until they are out of office. We will have to do these things. Mr. Vice President, all these are meager offerings that are happening just 15 months away from a general election. Mr. Vice President, the truth is that this hapless, incompetent, clueless, and wicked PNM government has been like a rudderless ship drifting aimlessly for the past 4 years without any plan, without any vision, without any direction. This economy has been on virtual autopilot, so much so, Mr. Vice President, that its GDP growth rate has been recorded as the 7th worst in the world in 2016, the 12th worst in the world in 2017, and the 15th worst in the world in 2018, according to the World Bank Development Indicators 2018. Mr. Vice President, this economy has been in a free fall for over the last 4 years, with negative economic growth of minus 6.3%, minus 2.3%, minus 0.2% in 2016, 2017, and 2018. Mr. Vice President, we expect, contrary to what the minister has just said about projections of 1.7% growth in 2019, we expect the economy to stagnate even further in 2019 and 2020. Mr. Vice President, after 2020, we will have a record of having 5 consecutive years of possibly negative economic growth under this administration. This intellectually bankrupt, shameless, and corrupt regime ought to be reminded, Mr. Vice President, that a nation's prosperity is created, not inherited. Innovation in our country is under siege. We live in a capitalist, free enterprise economy. And, Mr. Vice President, the government needs to be reminded that firms compete, not nations. It is the responsibility of the government to create the appropriate environment to make it easier for firms to do business. I'm coming to the incompetent Minister of Trade and Industry. All right, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, you have to protect me too, from this lady. Yeah, she's disturbing me.
Senator Ma, that's why we do not go down that road. Just temper the language and watch how you're referring to other members in the chamber. Continue.
Just reflecting the aspirations and dreams and hopes and wishes of the masses of people. Mr. Vice President, but I hear you. Mr. Vice President, I hear you. Mr. Vice President, business development stimulates sustainable employment and exposes citizens to new technologies, processes, and skills through research and development. Mr. Vice President, it is easier to do business in St. Lucia, in Dominica, and even in Jamaica than to do business in our beautiful Twin Island Republic state. Mr. Vice President, according to the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, this country dropped from the rank of 66 and plummeted to 105, thanks to an incompetent minister. Thanks to a minister who has not been doing her job well. Mr. Vice President, she has not been doing her job well. So today, Mr. Vice President, the ease of doing business is almost, you cannot understand why this government, a simple thing, Mr. Vice President, of starting a business, employing workers, registering a property, setting credit, protecting investors, trading across borders, enforcing contracts. Mr. Vice President, it takes almost 1,450 days to enforce a contract in Trinidad and Tobago. In Jamaica, it takes a mere 550 days. These are things, Mr. Vice President, that the government should be paying attention to, and our Honorable Minister of Trade and Industry. Mr. Vice President, in addition to the underperformance we have witnessed in almost every conceivable indice indice, a collapse in our performance. Whether we look at the index of economic freedom, the global peace index, the misery index, the governance indicators, perception of corruption index, or the global competitiveness index, under this government, Trinidad and Tobago has been sliding and reversing, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, for example, the index of economic freedom shows that Trinidad and Tobago has been trending downwards. 64.1 in 2015. The lower, the higher, the better. The lower, the worse. 61.4.1 rather in 2015. 62.9 in 2016. To 61.2 in 2017. To 57.7 in 2018. To 57% in 2019. That is the state of play under this government, and that is under 4 broad rules or headings, Mr. Vice President. The rule of law, government size, regulatory efficiency, and open markets, with government integrity under siege with just a mere 32.9%. Mr. Vice President, when it comes to the Global Peace Index, we ranked in 2016 84. It went to 97 in 2017. 86 in 2018, 93 in 2019, with the lower scores indicating a more peaceful country. This is the scorecard. In terms of the misery index, this country fell from a high of 65% in 2014 to a low of 34% in 2017, which shows the level of misery rising among the population under this government, Mr. Vice President, with the lower rank showing a country being worse off than a higher ranked country. Mr. Vice President, when you combine this collapse in the ranking under this index with the collapse in GDP per capita from US $20,000 in 2014 to roughly 17,000 and above in 2018, along with rising poverty levels and an exponential growth in unemployment levels, totaling, Mr. Vice President, we are estimated over 100,000 workers have been placed on the breadline. Therefore, the rate of misery has multiplied and escalated. Mr. Vice President, when you go to the World Bank publication on good governance indicators, you see where you have an indicator known as the control of corruption. This government, in 2011, under the People's Partnership, it was 54.9. The higher the value, the better off the country is in governance. Under the PNM in 2018, it declined to 44.2%. Mr. Vice President, and you can go on to other indicators like the government effectiveness. You see a decline. You go on, Mr. Vice President, to the rule of law. There is a fall, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, these indicators, what they are showing, in essence, is that our standards are falling under the PNM government. Democracy is under increasing threat, and corruption is also rife under this government. The abuse of public office has increased. This is what these indicators are showing since this government came to power. Mr. Vice President, this has led to a loss of confidence in the government and in the administration of justice. It is clear that the Rowley-led government poses a clear and present danger to this country's democracy, and they must be swiftly removed. And we are hoping that the people will begin that process on Monday, the 2nd of December, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, we must never forget that this PNM came to this parliament to undermine the people's access to information. when they brought the amendment to the Freedom of Information Act. And never forget that they were beaten back and they had to retreat and surrender to the people, to the will of the people. So, Mr. Vice President, and then you have, Mr. Vice President, statements being made by senior politicians in this country that the social media constitutes a threat to democracy. These are serious, serious matters that are undermining our democracy, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, when we look at the labor market in our country, we will recognize that job losses under this government, as I said, increased. Under the PNM, within 2 years of the arrival of the PNM, Mr. Vice President, the evidence is showing, the data is showing, that over 31,000 jobs were lost by mid-2017, as recorded in the review of the economy. When combined with the NIB data, which we have collected, and it was published as well, between mid-2017 to mid-2018, a further 26,800 persons lost their jobs. Mr. Vice President, when you add that in 2018 to 5,000 workers going home at Petrotrin, 200 at UTT, 631 at TSTT, and many more in other small entities and enterprises, we get, Mr. Vice President, close to 64,000 jobs being lost. Mr. Vice President, when we combine that with anecdotal evidence of other underreported jobs in our job losses, we arrived at close to 100,000 jobs being lost under this administration. I want to remind this country and to remind the Senate that under the United National Congress, in the People's Partnership, we created 55,000 jobs. We created 55,000 jobs. Mr. Vice President, when we say that we work and the PNM talks, this is a manifestation of it. Mr. Vice President, I would like sometime when the minister, that is the outgoing Minister of Labor, when the Honorable Minister rises, I would like the Honorable Minister to indicate to us how many collective agreements have been signed under her watch and registered at the Industrial Court. And, Mr. Vice President, what was the value of those collective agreements? We would like the Honorable Minister to tell us that, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, and then we come to the daily rated workers and this pension plan. Mr. Vice President, whatever can be done to help the daily rated workers, we would welcome. But you know what, Mr. Vice President? We know this is a promise that will never materialize. The PNM stands for that. Promises never materialize. Mr. Vice President, they're also promising the public servants to index their pension. But they said that will happen in 2020. That is when? 2020. Who will be there? They will not be there. So it's a promise that will never materialize. Mr. Vice President, there are some questions that the country is asking for clarification. For example, has there been a memorandum of agreement between the government and the recognized majority union in this matter on the rules of the pension plan? That is the majority union, NUGFW. Mr. Vice President, the question that is also being asked is who will become eligible to join this pension plan? Who will be the service provider for this pension plan? Has a provider been identified and selected? We need to know these things. Will the pension plan be retroactive? How will we deal with workers who retire at different ages within the daily rated sector? Mr. Vice President, there are workers who retire at the age of 60, and there are workers who retire at the age of 65. We don't know. What about the other unions like the Amalgamated Workers Union and the Contractors and General Workers Union? Are they going to be called in for consultation as it relates to this new pension plan that the government is speaking about? What will be the size of the management committee, Mr. Vice President? Will daily rated workers be eligible to access this plan? All of them, that is. These are matters that we'd like to have clarified in the interest of the workers of the country, the daily rated workers. Mr. Vice President, another area that we are concerned with, what has happened with the much promised social dialogue that the PNM boasted it would promote when it won the elections? What is the status of the Economic Development Advisory Board? What has become of the National Tripartite Development Advisory Board, or the National Tripartite Advisory Board? Could the outgoing Minister of Labour indicate to us in this Parliament what is the state of play with all the promised legislation? What about the amendment to the IRA? What about the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act? When are these amendments come in to this Parliament, Mr. Vice President? We don't know. The Honourable Minister herself touted something called a 10-point plan, called the National Employment Registry. What is the current status of this registry? What is the current status of collective bargaining? The PNM promised timely settlement of all outstanding negotiations in their manifesto, but nothing has materialized in that direction. Mr. Vice President, how many collective agreements? I am asking the Honourable, yes.
Okay. The noise level, while the member is trying to contribute, is getting a little high. Can we maintain a lower level, please?
Contain your voice.
Yes, I'll contain my voice. Mr. Vice President, how many collective agreements, I ask, have been signed and registered over the past 4 years under this regime? What has been the value of those collective agreements? Mr. Vice President, I can say without hesitation and equivocation that the partnership signed and registered over 130 collective agreements, and at the value of $4 billion in the 5 years that we were there. We got from the Minister of Labour, when she answered a question in another place, in another session, that there were only 18 collective agreements signed up to 2018.
Shame.
So, Mr. Vice President.
Senator, member. Senator Beaker, I just ruled in relation to the noise level while Senator Mark is contributing. Can we not have any outbursts while a member is contributing from either side of the floor? Senator Mark, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I now turn to corruption and poor procurement practices under this administration. Mr. Vice President, in his haste to misrepresent reality, the Minister of Finance stated that under this government, that I would like to describe as a kleptocratic government. No, you borrowed that from us. A kleptocratic government. Yes, I have it here, written here for you. He said, and I quote, "Corruption is no longer a feature of public transactions as it was prior to 2015. This is ludicrous and laughable and comical and jocular. Nothing could be further from the truth. Both Transparency International is showing that we are rising, as well as the Index of Economic Freedom is showing that governance weaknesses persist in this administration. There have been several questionable and suspicious transactions crying out for action, if not swift criminal forensic investigation." Let me outline a few to just alert the minister who seemed to have gone into a deep slumber. Let me indicate to this sleepwalking government that seems to be heading into oblivion. Let me indicate, Mr. Vice President, a few, just for your consumption. We are asking, and the public is asking, what is the real cost of the 2 Cape-class patrol vessels that we are expected to get into our waters for the Coast Guard by 2020? Mr. Vice President, a contract, we understand, was signed for $126 million for these 2 Cape-class vessels. Mr. Vice President, when we did our research, and we have the information, the Australian National Bank chartered from Austal in 2015, same vessels, same designs, same specifications. You know for what, Mr. Vice President? 2 of them for 63 million Australian dollars. We are being told, Mr. Vice President, that those same 2 vessels that we are buying from the same shipbuilder is costing us 126 million Australian dollars, twice the cost, which is 600 million TT dollars. Mr. Vice President, let us deal with what has been going on here. At first, Mr. Vice President, we got an announcement from the Australian themselves, that is Austal, indicating that these 2 vessels will cost 100 million Australian dollars. Then we got, which is 90 million US, by the way, Mr. Vice President. Then we got from an official from the Ministry of National Security, sometime in a Newsday article on the 2nd of August 2018, that each of the vessels will cost 35 million, which is 70. So we got 90, now we got 70, Mr. Vice President. Then we got a further statement from Mr. Vice President, from the Honorable Prime Minister, when he addressed what is called your Mind Your Business address to the nation on the 6th and 7th of January 2019. The Honorable Prime Minister put on the screen 600 million TT dollars, which was the equivalent of the 100 million Australian dollars, which is 90 million US dollars. Mr. Vice President, and here comes the grand finale. On Friday, the 18th of October, glued to my television, I heard the Minister of National Security informing the national community at the Standing Finance Committee that the 2 Cape-class patrol vessels is costing this country 41 million each, which is equivalent to 82 million US dollars. 41 million US per vessel, tallying to 82 million for 2, which is equivalent to 115 million Australian dollars, and not the contracted price of 126 million as announced by Austal. Mr. Vice President, somebody is not telling the truth. Who is misleading all? Did I say lying, sir? Who is misleading the country? Who is not telling the truth to the country? Mr. Vice President, this is a situation in which the people are being called upon to pay $300 million more for 2 vessels that cost the Australian Navy through the Bank of Australia $300 million. So there is $300 million discrepancy involved in this transaction. And we are calling for a criminal forensic investigation into this matter. We intend to write the Australian government on this matter. We intend to write them and the United States government an ethic on this matter. Mr. Vice President, this is scandalous. The second thing I want to go to quickly is the contract that was cancelled between CGGC and HTC. Mr. Vice President, we know that when you breach a contract, according to the terms, you pay. The government has cancelled this contract. We don't know what will be the final cost to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, but a price will be charged to us. And we would like some kind of investigation to be conducted into this matter, because there was a deliberate attempt to cancel this contract when the information was revealed that the government was selling out our patrimony to this Chinese company. So we want an investigation into that matter. Mr. Vice President, the Code of Conduct under the Integrity in Public Life Act talks about conflict of interest. We have a situation where government buildings are being rented for $600,000 a month from senior officials in this administration. This cries out for an investigation. This cries out for an independent investigation, Mr. Vice President, and the government say that they don't know what is going on. Mr. Vice President, this is serious business. Mr. Vice President, let me go quickly to the Petrotrin saga. I have in my possession, and which I can always pass on to you, Mr. Vice President, a document I got from the legal ministry called a debenture. I also have what is called a prospectus accompanying this debenture. It's a very fat document, 452 pages. This debenture agreement involved, Mr. Vice President, over US $1 billion. This was financed, or arranged rather, by Credit Suisse, Cayman Island branch, in the sum that I've just outlined, which is equivalent to about 8 billion TT dollars. This same Credit Suisse that arranged this whole transaction was recently sentenced by a district court in the United States, Mr. Vice President, for assisting US taxpayers in filing false income tax returns and other documents with the Internal Revenue Service. In other words, Credit Suisse was charged by the United States courts for tax evasion. Mr. Vice President, a judgment was handed down in December of 2014, in which this bank was fined 2.6 billion US dollars. It was a criminal offense under the US law. This happened in 2014. We were signing an agreement through Trinidad Petroleum Holdings Limited under the former chairman, Mr. Espine, with this same Credit Suisse in June of 2019, when we knew this company, this bank, was involved in money laundering and tax evasion. And our country today, Mr. Vice President, has been blacklisted by the Global Forum and the European Union. Mr. Vice President, this is a serious and scandalous state of affairs, and it requires the intervention of the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Commissioner of Police, Mr. Vice President, and the US government. Mr. Vice President, I want to go further and let you know that this debenture agreement, which is dated the 18th of June, was executed while this government and its agents were actively receiving and evaluating international bids for the lease and sale of our refinery. The evidence that we have, Mr. Vice President, and I want to put on record, we have no fight with the OWTU and their company called Patriotic Energies and Technologies. They were selected, they were the preferred bidder, we wish them luck. We have a duty as the alternative government and the incoming government to ensure there's accountability, there is openness, there is transparency, and there is good governance, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I would like to ask this government whether they are aware that in this debenture, that anyone can go and access in the registry, that this debenture is fully secured. All the assets of the refinery of Pointe-à-Pierre, at Pointe-à-Pierre, all the core assets are secured by nameless and faceless creditors, bondholders, and secure note holders. Is the government aware of this? If the government is aware of this, Mr. Vice President, why is the government, Mr. Vice President, giving the impression to this country...
you have 5 more minutes.
Yeah. Why is this government giving the impression to this country that everything is hunky-dory insofar as the sale of the refinery? Mr. Vice President, we are demanding that the master collateral and intercreditor agreement be tabled in this Parliament as quickly as possible. This requires public consumption, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, this transaction involving 9.75% rate of interest, that is the they borrowed, under that 1.1, there is a secured loan for $570 million US at a rate of 9.75. And this is guaranteed by Heritage Petroleum, Paria Fuel Trading Limited, and the same refinery, Mr. Vice President. So what we are seeing, Mr. Vice President, is a situation where our country may end up like the one that Mobutu was in charge of, Zaire, where, for instance, they pocket, that is, Zaire, Mobutu, pocket large chunks of monies at the expense of the people. And we want answers on this matter, Mr. Vice President, on this Petrotrin matter. Mr. Vice President, I also want to bring to your attention a matter involving NIB. NIB, as you know, Mr. Vice President, owns 20% of Massey Holdings. And because they own 20% of Massey Holdings, which is equivalent to 20 million shares, they ought to have a director on that board looking after the interests of our workers' interests, who are insurers with NIB. But, Mr. Vice President, there is no such directorship on the board of Massey looking after the interests of the workers of this country. And therefore, we are calling on the government, labor, and the employers to take action to ensure that the NIB is properly represented on the board of directors of that company called Massey Holdings Limited. I understand that they would fine $40,000 in 2011 for not indicating to the Securities and Exchange Commission that that company called NIB had become the largest shareholder in its operations. Mr. Vice President, I want to say quickly that the UNC has a national economic transformation master plan to resuscitate this country's economy. We want to leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution through a blueprint, multi-level economic strategic plan for economic growth and development. And Mr. Vice President, the prosperity of our nation will be based on the following principles. One, people-centered development, setting people back to work. We are going to have a pro-business facilitation exercise where we will allow the private sector to drive growth and development. We are going to have a third principle of resilience, that is, we'll deepen economic reforms with a human face. We will focus on local content by giving people a sense of ownership and independence. We will deal with sustainability by promoting our proper environmental stewardship. Mr. Vice President, I want to tell you, in our journey towards a better and brighter tomorrow, I want to say history will not be kind to this outgoing PNM government. They have sold our country for a mess of pottage. It is said, Mr. Vice President, when evil men plot, it is time for good men and women to plan and to take the necessary action to save our country from certain death and destruction. This is going to take place, Mr. Vice President, if you're not careful, by a group of over-ambitious, egotistical, and dangerous, narcissistic, and megalomaniac. Right. I have another word for them. I want to give you a substitution for this word. The brotherhood of wrongdoers.
Yes, yes.
Senator, your speaking time is up.
The brotherhood of wrongdoers.
Senator Deonarine.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. It is indeed a pleasure to have the opportunity to stand before this honorable House today and comment on the fiscal policy directive of the country. Many of us all live in the common misconception that the solution to the challenges of economic development lies in more growth, more economic growth. But the prosperity of a nation does not have to be contingent on economic growth alone, but implementing policies that will generate a greater level of efficiency. A greater level of efficiency in an economy such that it allows us to thrive during periods of adversity. Because, Mr. Vice President, adversity is inevitable, whether we are diversified or not. What are we aspiring to in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, this government have a national development framework that is embedded under Sustainable Development Goals. Looking at our progress in achieving these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, according to the Sustainable Development Goal Report 2019, it shows that there are significant challenges still remaining in achieving 9 of these 17 goals. While major challenges remain in trying to attain zero hunger, taking climate action, and creating a just system with strong institutions. Although we have progressed on many of these indicators, Mr. Vice President, there are still critical areas that we have fallen behind on, and leaves us questioning the manner in which the monies borrowed is being spent. Because deficit financing, the aim of deficit financing is to prevent regress during hard times, regress in economic development during hard times. Everyone is well aware of the pattern of running fiscal deficits. I don't need to repeat again that we are in the 10th year of running a fiscal deficit and in the 5th year of running a primary deficit. As energy prices dipped in 2014, the government embarked on a fiscal consolidation plan, which began in 2015. It is not an easy task in such a politically charged environment. The dichotomy between economic policy and public policy is a difficult balancing act. It is critical to balance the long-term benefits of needed economic policy with the short-term benefits that accrue through politically motivated public policy. But it is very difficult to get a population to try and come on board with fiscal consolidation, because rightfully so, we expect that our contributions to taxation should be transparently spent and should come back to us some way or the other through the reliable, transparent provision of public goods and services. During the fiscal consolidation exercise in trying to resort to fiscal prudence, the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP narrowed from 9% to 3.1%. This reduced expenditure was partly a cut in capital expenditure. After a 4 billion contraction in capital expenditure compared to fiscal 2015 levels, I am happy to see that once more we are allocating funds to try and increase our capital expenditure. So although there was a 10 billion cut in recurrent expenditure, it seems as if it was only temporary because the recurrent expenditure began to increase again since fiscal 2019. And this is primarily because of a recovery in the energy prices and because of recovery in energy production, not because we have attained any quantum of economic diversification outside of the energy sector. The truth is that the strength of the non-energy sector is not yet quite capable to earn stable streams of revenue. So we have no other choice. We need to continue to rely on the energy sector. Hence the reason the budget before us today speaks to incentives for the exploration, but at the same time makes amends to taxes being paid by energy companies. Or else, Mr. Vice President, where the money will come from? We have bills to pay. We have ministries grappling to meet their operating expenditure and struggling to carry out the maintenance of critical government facilities. So, Mr. Vice President, looking at the measures geared towards an increase in permanent expenditure, those geared towards increasing the salaries of employees in the OJT, URP, CPEP programs, the minimum wage increase, the increase in pensions, the increase in daily paid workers, the increase in pensions for daily paid workers, and the consideration for indexing pensions. Now, I'm not against these increases, but what I'm concerned about is our ability to sustainably maintain these increases. Because, Mr. Vice President, the beneficiaries of these increases are primarily the vulnerable people in our society, and are the first ones who usually feel the brunt of a negative energy price shock. When the country's revenue crumble, that's when we say we need to go back to the drawing board, we need to tighten our belts, we need to restructure these programs. People fall victims to these processes. The poor who are trying to make ends meet, women from single-parent homes, graduates with little work experience, retirees battling health problems. I mean, they are most prone to fall into unemployment and poverty from the cuts and readjustments in these programs. So while committing to these additional permanent sources of expenditure, kindly guide us to the permanent source of revenue identified to guarantee the sustainability of these increases, which accrue to the vulnerable members of our society. Because, Mr. Vice President, according to my analysis, we are still operating in a stagnating economy. The energy sector will continue to drive economic activity for the next decade or so, despite lower levels of investment, despite continued declines from maturing assets and challenging operating environments. Economic stagnation continues as real economic activity, in 2018, according to the Central Statistical Office, contracted by 0.2%. A closer look at the first quarter of 2019 indeed did show that we grew by 1.7%, but this is a 1.7% growth after a significant contraction of 3.2% in 2018, the last quarter of 2018. So, economic activity in the non-energy sector also continues to be sluggish because manufacturing and construction sectors have showed a real decline on a year-on-year basis. Now note, I'm referring to real GDP growth figures. Although the CSO figures show some growth in the manufacturing sector in the first quarter of 2019, real growth in the construction activity is not promising. Furthermore, looking at some other indicators, loans to businesses and firms have contracted in the first 6 months of 2019, according to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. While demand in the labor market is dampening. The number of advertisements that is being advertised on print media has declined, and the number of hours worked is on a downward trajectory. Although the fiscal deficit narrowed considerably, debt is projected to remain relatively stable from a debt to GDP perspective. However, we have a situation where the exchequer account is $40 billion in deficit. The net public sector debt has increased from $77 billion to $102 billion over the period 2015 to 2019. And the overdraft facility, of course, at the central bank stood at $10 billion as of May 2019. So, in addition, we need to be reminded that since 2010, several amendments to legislation was also made to raise the debt ceiling and to dispose of equity so that we can continue our deficit financing. An analysis of the debt dynamics of the country, commonly referred to as a debt sustainability analysis, shows that to maintain debt at its current levels of 62% of GDP, it will require the government to run primary surpluses that account for 3.1% of GDP in the long term. This is a significant fiscal adjustment that is required to preserve the sustainability of public debt. Now, of course, this is given the assumptions that the historical real interest rate continues to be 5.5%, and providing that the economy would grow at a minimum of 0.5% over the long term. Mr. Vice President, as we continued deficit financing over the last 4 fiscal periods, there has been a trend towards the issuance of domestic bonds. And the budget package is adding to the stock of domestic debt through the proposed issuance of a consideration of a proposed NIF Phase 2 housing bonds, VAT refund bonds, THA bonds. And I understand the economic logic in resorting to domestic mediums of deficit financing. The less external loans that we take, the less drain that we would have on our delegate foreign reserves. But we need to consider the impact on the domestic economy. Government expenditure has been the major driver of liquidity in the system. Government's financing tends to limit credit availability to the private firms, because the more liquidity that the government absorbs from the domestic system, the less there is available to finance private firms' capital projects through borrowing. By issuing domestic bonds, we are encouraging savings. But in a stagnating economy, encouraging savings for the business community should not be the focus of policy. The more liquidity businesses have tied up in bonds and savings, the less become available for investment to boost economic activity. Private firms, especially businesses, are still in a tender position as they recover from the fiscal consolidation efforts. External debt, on the other hand, we need to consider the rate at which external debt servicing requirements are increasing. It has more than doubled since fiscal 2016, where it was $1.1 billion, and for fiscal 2020, it is estimated at $2.4 billion. The financing requirements for external debt places more pressure on our delegate foreign exchange reserves. I would strongly advise the government to be very meticulous with the planning and oversight in the implementation of projects. We have absolutely no room for wastage of our foreign exchange in financing these loans and incur inefficiently managed projects. Projects that we have to depend on for the recovery of the construction sector and to generate some level of employment in the country. This then brings me to the point of the rate and terms of execution and implementation of external loans. I see a growing inclination towards financing from the Latin American Development Bank, CAF, especially for infrastructure projects. And I wonder how competitive the interest rate is compared to the other multilateral lending agencies. What are the terms of implementation and conditions for the release of funds? Is it governed by project management and monitoring and evaluation principles that ensure deliverables are results-based? The debt servicing requirements for the first time exceeded capital expenditure in 2016 and continues to grow further. For fiscal 2020, capital expenditure is estimated at $2.6 billion, whereas total debt service requirements stands at $8.7 billion, more than 3 times that of capital expenditure. This is not desirable and works against the government's forecast for economic growth in the next 3 years, as was outlined. Also, of course, we cannot forget the overdraft at the central bank. We can't forget that the debt stock does not include the overdraft facility at the central bank. The facility stood at $10.4 billion as at May 2019. A quick view at the draft estimates, I see that annually since 2018, $250 million is usually allocated towards covering this debt. However, in 2018, I see actual debt interest payment to finance the overdraft was $1.1 billion. And then in 2019, I see that the $250 million figure was revised upwards to $1.1 billion. And then there's an estimate of $250 million again in fiscal 2020. So I'm trying to understand exactly what is happening here. Is it that we have cash flow challenges and therefore have not been able to, and therefore have not been able to reduce the overdraft facility and therefore have been paying more to service the debt? Mr. Vice President, what this overdraft is really seeking to do is really to make cash advances to the Treasury to pay its bills. so that it can meet its overall deficit, meet requirements that deficit financing and energy revenues does not meet. What this does is that it expands the monetary base, which currently does not impact inflation because deposits are being sterilized. This does not mean that the inflation problem is benign. It is just dormant. Any significant increases in aggregate demand can result in inflation and put pressure on the foreign exchange reserves. If the expanded monetary base ever translates to money supply, our foreign reserves could deplete quickly. And this brings me to the balance of payments account. Though the current account recorded surplus since 2017, it continues to be outweighed by capital outflows, resulting in an overall external account deficit. Monetary policy by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago is being used to slow the rate of capital outflows. However, a weakened business environment could render narrowing of interest rate differential as very inelastic. This affects the already challenged foreign exchange environment we are operating in, where external debt financing, food imports, capital outflows, and so on are all placing additional pressure on the pegged exchange rate system, which results in the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago drawing down on more reserves. Although I understand that the rate of intervention by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago has been gradually slowing. But foreign exchange shortages continues to be a problem despite mild devaluation and despite the interventions by the Exim Bank. The impact of these shortages on the non-energy sector is a concern. These businesses are experiencing delays in settling bills and getting inputs in their production processes. Mr. Vice President, this in itself is a significant deterrent to business activity. No matter how many incentives that we implement across various sectors of the economy, a lack of foreign exchange availability can render your policies ineffective. And this will continue to be a problem because we have a real effective exchange rate that is overvalued. According to the IMF Article 4 consultation in 2018, the real effective exchange rate has appreciated by 21% between 2010 and 2018. What this means is that the external competitiveness of our non-energy exports is pretty low. The prices of our non-energy exports are simply overvalued compared to the rest of the world. In light of the economic stance of the country, the key challenges that Trinidad and Tobago will be facing over the medium term relates to the balancing of fiscal sustainability against the pursuit of long-term sustainable growth. The other important development challenges facing the country revolve around the poor quality of institutions, improving the business climate, improving our competitiveness and productivity, and infrastructure. Now, in balancing fiscal sustainability in the pursuit of long-term economic growth, there are several interventions that could be made. Our aim to balance the budget by 2020, 10 years after it initially went into deficit, and Mr. Vice President, 2 years after the initial plan for balancing the budget in 2020, as was outlined in the medium-term fiscal consolidation plan in the fiscal package 2017. So automatically, after we record a balanced budget in fiscal 2020, does it automatically mean that we should expect budget surpluses in the future? How many years afterwards should we expect budget surpluses? But on the other hand, what are the incentives that the government has to adopt timely, appropriate policies that would not be negated by subsequent expansionary fiscal policy contingent on energy price increases? Economists try hard to predict the prices of energy, and it still remains largely unpredictable. We cannot continue the habit of spending almost everything that comes in on an assumption that revenue will continue to come in. The supercycle reality means that our reliance on energy exports and revenue should have a simple fiscal rule to guard against the sudden drops in revenue that can happen with sudden crash in energy prices. The rule is simple. Spend less when prices are high so that you have buffers when prices collapse. So all of our minds may immediately be thinking about, isn't this what the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is for? It's not enough. I'm talking about a comprehensive piece of legislation for a fiscal rule framework, such as which includes an overall balance rule. For example, fiscal balance that does not exceed a deficit of 0.5% of GDP. An expenditure rule where, for example, the rate of growth of nominal current expenditure cannot exceed the estimated long-term growth in GDP. A debt anchor, establishing the 65% debt to GDP ratio in law. A legislative fiscal council, that is an independently fiscally responsible oversight committee. Sanctions for breach in any of these fiscal rules. And of course, the appropriate escape clauses to provide for incidences of war, natural disasters, and so on. Now, Grenada, Jamaica have already established a fiscal rule framework. Barbados and Bahamas are in the process of setting up theirs. I know we might be saying that these countries have undergone IMF structural adjustment programs and have severe macroeconomic limitations. We are nowhere near there. But what I'm trying to say is that we should not let it reach to that point. In order for us to implement these structural changes in the way our fiscal accounts and debt is managed in the country. Of course, from a political perspective, there is little incentive to think about what may happen 10 years down the road. But imagine if we had such a framework. Imagine how much less blame games would go on in this honorable house. Imagine how much permanent forms of expenditure we would not have committed to, such that we're in a position where 55% of our total expenditure goes to transfers and subsidies on an annual basis. Imagine the level of efficiency state enterprises would have been operating at. Imagine how many interruptions in policy continuity from changes in government that could have been avoided. Now, a fiscal rule framework is just one part of the solution. Institutional strengthening is also necessary. And institutional strengthening does not necessarily mean insisting on the best legislation, but working towards increasing their capacity and transparency. Because Mr. Vice President, diversification is a slow process, and it cannot be built on lethargic functioning institutions. Diversification requires building an environment conducive to strong and stable revenue-generating potential of the non-energy sector. We cannot yet rely entirely on the non-energy revenues because the volatility of the non-energy sector revenue has statistically shown that it is even more volatile than energy revenue. It therefore means that we have to work on the structural inadequacies that plagues the system to create a progression to less volatile means of revenues outside of the energy sector. It is about instilling a culture of performance management across the public administration. This is a medium to long-term structural effort. Poor work ethic and lack of productivity may very well be a problem in public sector institutions, but have we ever stopped to ask why? Low worker morale usually comes from the perception that we cannot do anything to influence meaningful change in a system. Graduates get sucked into an age-old organizational structure where you are told, well, this is how things are done here. And advancement to leadership position is based on the number of years you have in the public service as opposed to your innovative capabilities and your ability to transform an institution. The effectiveness of policy is largely based on the quality of institutions, Mr. Vice President. Which brings me to procurement. The public procurement reform has been on the agenda for almost 20 years, and procurement processes continues to be something that lacks transparency. We can't just say that we are coming on board with the procurement board and fully proclaiming the legislation in 2020. We need to really push for this to happen, especially given the amount of infrastructure projects that we have planned for fiscal 2020. Under the current arrangements, I believe, according to Section 20A of the Central Tenders Board Act, it is institutions, public bodies, could very well, including ministries, could very well bypass the Central Tenders Board and go ahead and conduct procurement by themselves. But this poses challenges because the capacity of state enterprises or public bodies to conduct procurement processes is not known. I don't know if they have specific procedures that they approve, but are they publicly available? This provides a challenge for potential bidders who are not informed on the procedures that must be followed, and they cannot present complaints. Are they able to present complaints if the procedures are not followed? Now, another challenge is that when the Procurement Act is fully proclaimed, it'll mean that these state enterprises would also lose their businesses. What is the financial position of these firms, and do they have the financial resources to pay these contracts, or does it add to their debt, or that is being covered by the government, that is guaranteed by the government? I also understand the establishment of procurement units in relative ministries and agencies is well on the way. Through a quick scan of the draft estimates of the recurrent expenditure for 2020, I see that provisions are being made in most ministries for a procurement unit. So how many established and functioning procurement units we have? Have they received the necessary training? Have there been any challenges in staffing these procurement units? Because what I understand is that procurement certification and experience is a skill gap that exists in this country. Is it that we are finding it problematic to satisfy the pre-qualifying conditions for the full proclamation of the procurement legislation? Because the goalpost keeps moving. And as this happens, standardized procurement processes may not very well be abided by and contribute to loopholes in awarding contracts for state projects, especially given the amount of capital projects coming out of the PSIP and the Infrastructural Development Fund, the IDF, in this fiscal year. Government plans for major investments in infrastructure in this fiscal year. I think it's almost $3 billion that is being allocated to the IDF. It is critical that quicker advances are being made also to implement the public financial management system. I know the government has undertaken important back office modernization initiatives, which includes the implementation of an IFMIS platform, an integrated financial management information system platform. A quick look at the IDB's Inter-American Development Bank's website, their procurement portal, shows that the contract for the IFMIS system was actually awarded to a Canadian firm. How far are we from the full operationalization of this IFMIS system? A smoothly functioning public financial management system is critical as it can encourage a culture of planning, prioritization, and evaluation of capital investments because of the higher degree of accountability that is required. In encouraging results-based budgeting, an IFMIS system would allow for alignment of budget classification to policy priorities. It'll become easier for both citizens and government officials to track the effectiveness of spending in attaining these development priorities. And as the need for results-based management emerges through the implementation of this IFMIS system, the demand for data will increase. And therefore, the demand for data will increase, and therefore a culture of evidence-based, data-based decision-making needs to be cultivated. As a result, we need to continue to build capacity of the CSO and move quickly to the legislative changes that are required for the establishment of the National Statistical Institute. Now, the last area that I want to touch on before I conclude is with respect to energy transition and resilience. The world today is in the midst of 3 mega environmental crises right now. One is human-induced climate change, the second is massive destruction of biological diversity, and the third is mega pollution. This is no news to anybody. Apart from over-reliance on the energy sector for energy revenues, we need to be reminded that the world is becoming more aware and taking drastic action when it comes to climate change. Being a world-class, heavily diversified downstream energy sector, having a world-class downstream energy sector, and being a world-class producer of nitrogenous fertilizers, we need to have a backup plan. The demand for ammonia, urea, and methanol may very well decline soon, or made more expensive as countries move towards introducing tariff structures in their home country to discourage the importation of these materials and use their that are used in the agricultural industry. As countries move towards mitigating the harmful effects of runoff that nitrogenous fertilizers have on the blue economy and ecology of our marine life. With respect to the sustainable energy transition plan outlined in the fiscal package, it is a start. I mean, I commend the government on the initiative to introduce energy efficiency in all government offices and the plan for the ban of styrofoam and so on. But I also think more should be done to educate the public on the need for a sustainable energy transition. And as part of the plan, I would have liked to see that there was some sort of transition measure to implement this strategy where a public conservation, energy conservation campaign is launched. Rather than just distribute these light bulbs, I don't know, we should be telling people why we need to be using light bulbs, LED light bulbs in the first place, because a significant chunk of the population still does not understand the transition requirements and also the need for energy conservation. But with respect to the plans for sustainable cities and communities, this is the direction that we need to head. This is the direction that we need to head to at this point. But it is quite overambitious when you think about the flooding situation we are still grappling with. According to the Sustainable Development Goals Report 2019, we are progressing to reduce particulate matter in urban areas. But this indicator also requires satisfaction with public transport. Satisfaction with public transport does not necessarily correlate with buying more PTSC buses. It is more about addressing the key reasons why the utilization rate of the service has been so low. Is it because of safety? Is it because of lack of reliability of timely service? Now, the last thing that I want to mention is with respect to the renewable energy, transition to renewable energy. Now, I think that a target of 10% renewable energy by 2021 was established by the Ministry of Public Utilities or Ministry of Energy and Energy Industry. And this target is for a waste-to-energy project and a utility-scale renewable energy project. For this renewable energy pillar of this plan to be successful,
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Interministerial coordination is essential, especially amongst the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy, and the Ministry of Public Utilities. A renewable energy transition starts with a 20-year plan or at least a 15-year plan. It cannot be ad hoc and add some solar here and add some solar there, add some geothermal as well. The system architecture requires proper understanding and transfer of skill and knowledge. Now, Mr. Vice President, I wish if I had more time to go in more depth with the renewable energy transition, but at this point I would like to wrap up my presentation. Now, my presentation today basically looked at the overview of past fiscal periods. I looked at the reversal of recurrent expenditure. I talked a little bit about the stagnating economy. I spoke significantly about debt sustainability, external sustainability, and also fiscal sustainability. I also mentioned the importance of institutions with specific focus on procurement, public financial management, the National Statistical Institute. Now, since everyone ended with a fancy line, a fancy quote, my message today, now I really didn't plan for it, but my message today is, don't let the story of us as a unique people of this country be one driven by persuasion to spend more money. To spend more money that we don't have on things that we don't need, to create impressions that may not necessarily last. With those few words, Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, it's indeed a pleasure to be allowed the opportunity to provide just a little bit of insight into what has been happening with respect to the Ministry of National Security over the past fiscal, and importantly, to provide also some idea and some indication as to the roadmap ahead of us at national security, as much as I can in any event, over the next fiscal. And I'd like to start, Mr. Vice President, by just indicating that one of the areas that national security contributes, and one of the areas that we should all in this House and the other place be able to contribute to, is that of legislation. Because ultimately, as legislators, that is part and a major part of our role, unless you're in a government position. So just to remind people that it was in November of last year that the government, after many, many decades of listening to people and listening to people complain about the scourge of something as simple as scratch bombs, we passed the Prohibition of Scratch Bombs Order 2018 on the 22nd of November 2018. We have also piloted, and it's really been led by the Minister in the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, working along with national security, the Private Security Industry Bill 2019, which is currently before a Joint Select Committee of Parliament, and making good progress with quite an extensive amount of consultation taking place. Mr. Vice President, three extremely important pieces of legislation that are making an impact immediately upon the area of crime in Trinidad and Tobago that were pushed from the Ministry of National Security. And I thank at this stage my government colleagues for supporting the move of national security are the anti-gang legislation, the Firearms Amendment Bill 2019, and the Bail Amendment Bill. And Mr. Vice President, I'd like to thank the members of this House, of the Senate, who supported the passage of that legislation, because that legislation, despite all of the critics and the naysayers, has been effectively utilized by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and our intelligence services, and they have made significant inroads into the gang activities taking place in Trinidad and Tobago. There have been, and I put it on record here in the Senate, a number of significant charges specifically under the anti-gang legislation. That anti-gang legislation recently has brought to bear on 4 persons who it is alleged and now have been charged under the anti-gang legislation for being significant players in the criminal industry of Trinidad and Tobago. And that is in addition to those who were charged previously. And I'm told, and I'm happy to hear this, that today it was also laid in the Senate a further amendment to the bail bill. That amendment will be dealt with at the appropriate time, but I'd like to put a marker down now. It is a significant and necessary tool because the types of firearms that we're dealing with on the outside in the hands of the criminal element are very sophisticated firearms. National security has also in the past year, Mr. Vice President, significantly appointed leaders to the positions of the Commissioner of Police. That was done in the House of Representatives without the support of the opposition. The Chief of Defense Staff, who is one of our youngest Chief of Defense Staffs in many, many years, and also recently a permanent director of the Security Services Agency, or Intelligence Services. The benefit that we already have been seeing over the past year of these three individuals is they all came from the same batch. Something that may seem as trivial as that, Mr. Vice President, was a strategic decision by the government out of the Ministry of National Security. And again, the country is reaping the benefits of those decisions. Mr. Vice President, I'd also like to put on record that the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service has received an increased allocation over the next fiscal. So when people bandy about the figure of $6 billion to national security, that includes over $2.5 billion to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. And in accordance with Section 123A of the Constitution, the Commissioner of Police is the accounting officer. The Commissioner of Police for the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service is in charge of administrative and financial areas of the police service. That extra almost $400 million was again a strategic decision by the government of Trinidad and Tobago to ensure that the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service are properly asseted and properly given the necessary fiscal support that they require as we tackle this scourge of crime over the next fiscal. Also coming out of national security, we intend to bring regulations to deal with our intelligence services, and also we have finally, I understand it is now out of the LRC and should be laid shortly, amendments to the dangerous drug schedule to deal with this recent phenomenon that we're facing of ecstasy pills and Zessa pills. Again, the government is working to criminalize those areas. What has also significantly happened in the past fiscal is the strengthening of our security relations with the energy sector. What we did, Mr. Vice President, is we signed on the 27th of November 2018, as the Minister of National Security, I signed a memorandum of understanding with major stakeholders in the energy sector of Trinidad and Tobago, both upstream and downstream, to ensure that we have a specific plan to deal with the energy assets in Trinidad and Tobago and to properly secure them and to make sure that we're all working on the same page, government and private sector, as we bring to bear the state security apparatus to better secure the energy sector. The Ministry of National Security also signed an interagency MOU to regulate fishing in August of 2019, and I'll deal with the issue of fishing a little later on in my contribution. This was also signed along with officials from the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, Ministry of Works and Transport, Ministry of Trade and Industry, and the THA. And I'm sure that my colleague, the Honourable Minister for Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, will touch on that in his contribution, what it is we intend to do with the fishing folk in Trinidad and Tobago and the GPS registration of their vessels, etc. We have also worked hard in properly securing and improving the security arrangements at the Piarco International Airport, along with the TSA out of the United States. And I'm happy to tell Trinidad and Tobago, based on the work that was done along with the Ministry of Works and Transport, we staved off any threat of being downgraded by the TSA. And Piarco now is a much safer and more secure institution, and we will continue to work towards improving the security at Piarco. I'm also happy to announce, and I'd like to personally thank Senator Rambarat for his assistance on this. In the past year, and to thank my cabinet colleagues for their support, in the past year, for the first time, a government of Trinidad and Tobago has granted parcels of land and buildings to the Trinidad and Tobago Social Welfare Officers Association, the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Officers Association, the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Officers Association, so they can, for the first time, build their own headquarters and wellness centers. So we've looked after the police officers, our prison officers, and our fire officers in that manner in the last fiscal year. Mr. Vice President, now to deal with some of the specifics with respect to the various divisions that fall under national security. Over the past year, a lot of time, energy, and resources have been placed on working with our prison system. In fact, just this morning, I was speaking with Mr. Saran Richards. We have formed a very good relationship with and working with the Prison Officers Association. As we understand their plight, we understand the dilemma, we understand the circumstances under which they work. In the past year, Cabinet approved and we have been implementing improvements to the remand yard at Golden Grove. Some of these improvements will include better ventilation, the better toilet facilities in each of the cells, making the cells more in line with what you would expect in this type of environment in the 21st century. I've also visited personally and walked the remand at Golden Grove, Port of Spain, as well as what exists in Tobago, and I'll come to Tobago in a short while, and heard the plights of those who are held in remand as well as the prison officers, and I give them the assurance that this government is working feverishly to improve the conditions at the various remand facilities. We are also improving the CCTV camera systems. The alarm systems at Golden Grove are almost completed. The alarm system at the maximum security prison is being upgraded after it was left unattended for too many years, as well as the CCTV camera system at Golden Grove, as well as the maximum security. We are in the process of upgrading all of these, and we will then feed the monitoring back to the National Operations Fusion Center, where there will be multi-agency task force set up. So it will be all of national security looking on at what is going on there and providing the levels of support. I'm also happy to say that for the first time since the inception of the prison service in Trinidad and Tobago, they finally, in this last year, have their own colors, and that means their own prison flag, which is a very big step for the prison service. There have also been a number of rehabilitative programs in the prisons, in the areas of debate, art, pushing the library, pushing for better library facilities, other programs working along with, for example, Mr. Wayne Chance, and working towards providing those inmates in our prison service with hope that when they come back out, they will be better reintegrated into society. And I use this opportunity, Mr. Vice President, to make a plea to the population to understand that when dealing with our prisoners and many of our inmates who are remorseful and would like a second chance, that we find a way as private sector and as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to allow them to reintegrate into society. I've also requested of the Office of the Attorney General, and the Attorney General has assured me he's working on it and is close to completion, for the first time, a probation service that will deal with persons in our prison system who qualify that they can be let out on probation and monitored. The electronic monitoring system, I'm happy to say we finally have all of the equipment in hand. We've set up the monitoring system. Right now, the only thing we're waiting on is for the judiciary to amend what needs to be amended on their side. Because at the end of the day, the judiciary are the ones who would be ordering or sentencing who can use these electronic monitoring bracelets. We are ready to go. We are also in the process of upgrading all of the fence at the various prison facilities, meaning at Golden Grove, at the YETC. Also, I've asked for it to be done at the IDC for immigration. Unfortunately, these things have been left alone for too long. And I wonder that when we spent $80 million as the people of Trinidad and Tobago on a fence, and a very sophisticated fence outside of the maximum security between 2010 and 2015, what really was the intent of it? I remember going there, seeing that all that is contained within this fenced area that cost the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago $80 million is grass. There's nothing else on the inside. Whereas we're trying to fix our remand facilities, we've brought that cost down to within the $60 million range. So if that money had been spent then when we had money on improving the remand, we would be in a much far further advanced place for prison services in Trinidad and Tobago. The Eastern Correctional Facility. Mr. Vice President, this is a facility that irks me very much in particular. I believe it was sometime in 2011, this massive acreage of warehousing facility was bought for over $230 million, $230 million in cash paid for this Eastern Correctional Facility, and then it was not utilized properly. In fact, the area being utilized there is less than, I would say, 10% of the whole square footage and acreage size of the facility. What we did is we looked at it. We have now implemented a second IDC facility there, but it is still massively underutilized. So one question, and I ask the question as a taxpayer here and as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, what really was the payment of $230 million for warehousing facility done in the Ministry of National Security in or around the years 2011 to 2013? Why was that done? Why was it underutilized? Why was that transaction completed? We've also provided the prisons with 250 new firearms, and we've started the procurement process for the second set of handguns. I'd like to put on record, because I heard the most ridiculous propositions in another place in response to some of these initiatives. Yes, there are about 3,000 prison officers, but they already had a number of firearms, and it is not every prison officer who will be provided. There's a policy in place with a proper threat assessment. The prison officers already had firearms. And what we have done is we have now provided an extra 250, and we've started the procurement for another 250, which is about to be completed. We provided 178 stab vests. The second procurement process was begun and is completed now for the provision of another 202 stab vests, with the last set being received in October 2014. Cabinet is currently taking a decision or contemplating the building of a special court right outside the maximum security prison facilities. The idea of this special court is that high-risk prisoners will be easily walked across from the prison facilities to these special courts. So the shutting down of Port of Spain, as we see happening too frequently on a weekly basis, when a certain high-risk, someone determined to be a high-risk prisoner is being brought to Port of Spain, will be a thing of the past. Tobago. The correctional facility at Tobago is archaic. I've spoken about it before on my tour of Tobago and the prison facilities at Tobago. It is highly unsatisfactory. The Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago is taking a decision for the construction of a new correctional facility in Tobago. That would have been done already, the decision taken. However, when the note was first brought to me, it was for over $250 million. I immediately rejected that as the Minister of National Security, because on this side, we are very concerned about protecting taxpayers and their money and how money is spent. So you heard a short while ago a former administration paying $230 million in cash for warehouses. This administration, for the construction of a state-of-the-art new correctional facility in Tobago, rejected the first price of $250. It came a second time for about $150 million. Again, I rejected that, and I've sent them back, saying that we will not unnecessarily burden the taxpayers. We have also taken a decision to complete an unfinished building that was being constructed in the previous time and was just left as a shell, as a rehabilitation center for girls to have a female YTC facility. I'm happy to tell the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago the cost of completing this building will be less than $4 million, as opposed to going out and trying to construct and waste money on a completely new facility. Our female and juvenile offenders, unfortunately, is becoming more prevalent. They are proving to be very demanding and very difficult at times. So a specific facility that will conform with the legislation is going to be constructed for girls, a female equivalent of YTC, utilizing the shell of a building that was left abandoned. We have heard, and I personally went and toured and saw the vehicles being used by the prison officers. They are not in a satisfactory condition. This is something that I went to my cabinet colleagues about before we settled the budget. Extra money was provided for the provision of vehicles for prison officers. I have asked our permanent secretaries to commence the procurement of these vehicles, and I intend over the next fiscal year for us to do the procurement of vehicles for the prison officers that is long overdue. With respect to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, Mr. Vice President, Cabinet recently approved a new structure for the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service that moves more with the times. We're focusing more on intelligence-driven operations. There are now a number of specialized units in the police service that we've put under one umbrella and head. For example, the SORT. We also now have SIU, and there are a number of other specialized units that we are utilizing in the police service whilst providing support across the various divisions. You have heard, the population would have heard in the last year the announcement of the re-establishment of the Marine branch. Just in conversation with the Commissioner of Police this morning, he assures me that within the next 2 months, we will be able to see the physical launch of a new re-established Marine branch that will assist in the coastal patrolling and as well as inland with some flat-bottom boats that can go up the tributaries. Work has been started on the Carenage Police Station. We opened the Shervan Police Station, a state-of-the-art, and I dare say probably one of the best, if not the best, police station in the whole Caribbean region. We have almost finished the next state-of-the-art police station in Roxborough, in Tobago East, and I look forward to the opening of that, I'm told, before the end of this year. We are currently constructing a new fire station. Again, in Roxborough. I'm happy to report that while sod was turned a few months ago, work has proceeded apace, and I expect that Roxborough Police Station to be opened and utilized in the next fiscal year. Mr. Vice President, another significant achievement for the people of Trinidad and Tobago was the refurbishment of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Patrol Bike Unit. You'd have seen we recently took possession of over 200 patrol bikes that I'm happy to tell the people of Trinidad and Tobago we got free and gratis from the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So that is a great example of how this government operates in terms of seeking to get best value for money, and on this occasion, paying no money for 200 patrol bikes. And this government is not about the granting of contracts, which I'll come to in a short while, and who is given what contract, who buys a property for $230 million and then doesn't worry to use the property, and these types of things. We seek where we can to get best value for money. I take the opportunity as well to thank the United States government at this stage for donating a significant amount of canine assets to our Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and our prison services. You saw some of them on display at the recent Independence Day parade. We thank the United States government for that. This government has rebuilt the bridges and the relationships with many of the foreign governments, and we've been working hard to establish and get as much as we can for Trinidad and Tobago. The ERP vehicle system is working. It is being utilized. We are trying to further upgrade it and further provide resources to have more lines available and a better connection between the civilian persons who answer the telephones and our police service so you can have a quicker response. If you look at the budget, this budget, you would see that the government has taken a decision to provide the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service with $70 million for vehicles. Now, these vehicles will include some of the marine vessels, but $70 million as well for them to upgrade their fleet of vehicles. We've also provided $25 million for the purchase of specialized equipment for the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. That this equipment, once procured and implemented, is going to assist the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service in their fight against crime. Minor equipment purchases, we've provided $40 million, and other minor equipment, $19 million. And I take the opportunity now to put to rest, Mr. Vice President, a false narrative that is being pushed out there and being pumped out there about the Commissioner of Police saying that he did not have sufficient financial resources. The record reflects that at the end of fiscal 2019, when the books were closed, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service got over $330 million for goods and services that was way above their allocation, and that was topped up and further pushed upward in the mid-year review, and all of the funds that were allocated were provided to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. The anti-gang work. Anti-gang work is proceeding apace in a multi-agency task force operation. That multi-agency task force is working well. It includes our intelligence services, our prison services, our defense force, all supporting the Trinidad and Tobago Police Services. You would have seen recently us inspecting, not launching, the Strike Back Operation 2. Again, it was buried, unfortunately, the statistics coming out of that. To date, that Strike Back 2 operation has led to the arrest of well over 170 criminals and the prosecution of many of them. And we're marrying that with the firearm amendments that were passed here in the Senate and in the House, and as well the bail amendment. And at this stage, Mr. Vice President, through you, I'd like to tell all members of the Senate, those two simple, what may have seemed to be simple amendments, are making a critically important advantage, or providing an important advantage to our Trinidad and Tobago law enforcement. We utilized it recently. The anti-gang legislation with some well-known gang leaders. We went for detention orders under the anti-gang legislation. The courts granted the detention orders. That allowed us to put all of the evidence to the criminals whilst they were still under a period of arrest. Subsequently, on the advice of the Director of Public Prosecutions, they were charged, and now they are not out on bail. We had the most, in my view, Mr. Vice President, the most ridiculous, one of the most ridiculous scenarios took place recently, where we held someone with 9 AR-15s. An AR-15 is a machine for war. It is a tool designed for warfare. It is a machine gun. We held someone in my constituency of Belmont with 9 of them, and on his first occasion in court, a magistrate granted bail. What we're coming with the bail amendment that's been laid here today as another provision is to prevent those types of occasions, because we cannot be carrying out these types of exercises, tackling crime, and then have them spilling back out onto the streets straight away. We need a fighting chance, and that is what we would be asking for. The strike back operations are working well. What we've also seen in the past year is a resurgence and an increase in the multi-agency operations between our defense force, the prisons, the police service, and our intelligence services, and our operations being driven by intelligence, and they're meeting with a lot more success now. The Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, I'm happy to report that the CCC and MILAT programs, Cabinet took decisions to extend these programs and in fact extend the intake of these programs. They are working very, very successfully. We did a tracer study. To see that those who are in the programs, how they're going on after they've left the programs. The programs are providing our defense force with some intake to the normal defense force, but also all of those, the vast majority of those interviewed, said that that made a huge and a world of difference to their lives. So these programs are, I thank my cabinet colleagues for assisting and supporting the decision to continue and increase these programs. Also, within the last couple of months, we opened the Army Learning Center Training Building. This is a one-of-the-kind in the CARICOM region, and what it is really a learning facility for Trinidad and Tobago Army, for the regiment side of life, where now, instead of having to send our officers and those who want to progress their careers throughout the defense force away on training, we're now able to offer it in our own state-of-the-art facilities, which are housed at Tetron, and they're to be congratulated for that. Camp La Romaine. We are going to be spending a lot more time, emphasis, and focus, $10 million on Camp La Romaine during this fiscal, to better the facilities there so we can launch specific operations from the southern part of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, our coastal radar system, despite all of the suggestions out there that the coastal radar system is not working, that is completely false. The coastal radar system is working, and I'd like to take this opportunity because I feel very proud as a Trinidadian. Recently, I had a meeting with the Israeli providers of this coastal radar system, and the gentleman who has actually been there from inception when this system was put in place in about 2005 said that the officers, the men and women who maintain our coastal radar system, not only in Trinidad, but also up at some of the OECS islands where we also have a couple of radar systems. They said they are the best in the world that utilize this system. And to hear that our Trinidadian men and women in the Coast Guard who have been trained and who are maintaining this system to be declared to be amongst the best in the world, that was something that I felt very proud about as a Trinidadian. We have taken the decision to upgrade the system, and it's an unfortunate attribute, but a necessary one of national security, that unfortunately you can't get into the particulars, and you can't speak about exactly what the upgrades are, how they would affect things, but I can guarantee to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that these upgrades are going to make another world of difference as they take us much further into the type of technology that is available. And I'm happy to say, Mr. Vice President, once again in this instance, we saved tens of millions of US dollars in how we went about procuring the upgrades. Because you see, we didn't just let any and everybody come in and push a system down our throat, as may have happened before. Also, what I'm happy to update on is, again, another area of savings. A proposal had been brought and had been approved for new interceptors. 3 new interceptors for Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard at about approximate cost of $60 million. So that was to be approximately 60 million TT dollars, approximately $20 million for an interceptor. When that was brought to me as Minister of National Security, I refused it. I asked for a report on the existing interceptors. It came back to me that there were 14 that with some work and some new engines could be brought back into use. That is going to cost the taxpayers $7 million as opposed to $60 million for 3 interceptors. Another massive area of savings coming out of the Ministry of National Security. I'm assured that the engines for those interceptors, which we ran into some difficulty in being able to procure, will arrive during the course of this week or early next week, and then we will be able to add 10 more of those interceptors in a phased rollout basis over the next month and a half. The Air Guard. The Air Guard has been utilizing the 2 fixed-wing aircraft, 2 C-26 aircraft over the past year. We are in the process of getting drones. I'm looking forward to being able to make that announcement in the not-too-distant future, and the savings, once again, to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Over the next fiscal, I hope to be able to introduce, once my cabinet colleagues support it, an air unit that will be run by the Air Guard. Because before, what you had was the NOC, which at the time fell under the Office of the Prime Minister, purchasing helicopters, one of which never made it to Trinidad and Tobago, even though we were paying over $200,000 US a month. It was always in a hangar in Delaware. The next one that made it to Trinidad and Tobago, within a few months of landing here, was unable to be utilized. So you had the NOC having those and some other small rotary wing assets. You then had the Air Guard having 4 AW aircraft, Augusta Westland 139 aircraft that were originally for the OPVs and much too big, much too expensive. Those were grounded. I'm hoping to go to my colleagues very shortly with a new proposal for the utilization of those aircraft on commercial terms with National Helicopter Services, and us to get some specific helicopters that will be put under the Air Guard but used in an air unit for both the TTDF, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, as well as our intelligence services. So again, ensuring best value for money for Trinidad and Tobago. I'd like to also thank the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, and in particular some of our specialized units, for assisting the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service in some of the border protection that has been going on land within the past year. The Forensic Center. Mr. Vice President, I have great pleasure to say that for the first time in decades, we have filled all 4 permanent posts of forensic pathologists at the Forensic Science Center. Of course, the forensic pathologists are the individuals who deal with autopsies, and we're not stopping there. We continue to work with the UNDP, and we expect to get 2 volunteer forensic pathologists within this fiscal, which will take the full complement beyond the 4 in the establishment to 6, and hopefully ensure that any difficulties with the performance of autopsies are a thing of the past. And that has finally happened after decades. What we've also done at the Forensic Science Center is we are in the process of hiring 10 specific specialized professionals to bolster the work being done there, including in the ballistics area. I want to put on record that we have been receiving the support of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service armorers, as well as the CIRU unit, in performing the necessary ballistic tests, but we are looking to supplement and increase our capabilities in that area. Immigration. Mr. Vice President, over the past year, our immigration officers have performed admirably. I would like to thank them for their service, and in particular, they took on the task of the Venezuelan registration system. It was driven specifically by immigration. We registered 16,523 persons claiming to be Venezuelans during that period of time. We always said that after that registration process, there would
Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much. There would have to be a verification and a due diligence exercise that has taken place. 10,000 is in the process of taking place, but 10,000 people have passed. We have issued 8,000 cards, and I'm happy to say that whilst Cabinet had approved a cost of $5 million, our expenditure by the 30th of September 2019 was only $4.3 million for that whole process. Over the next year, we will be getting rid of immigration forms, and we'll also be moving to a biometric system. Allow me now at this stage, as I have my last 5 minutes, to address the spurious allegations and falsehoods that continue to be proffered by Senator Wade Mark with respect to the hostile Cape Class vessels. The first thing is, these hostile Cape Class vessels were procured directly from the Australian government. You would recall that when we announced we were procuring these vessels, those on the other side, the opposition, wrote to the Australian Attorney General to try and topple the whole deal. Of course, that was rejected. The vessels are being financed by the Australian EFIC. They are the ones who are doing the financing. This claim that there were vessels purchased in 2015 for the Australian government at a much cheaper cost, it depends on what you put into the vessels. The cost of the vessels have, of course, increased as steel and aluminum and all other methods of technology have since moved away. And I'd like to read very briefly. First of all, each vessel is costing $41 million. That $41 million is specific for the type of equipment and technology that we want to put on board. This is what Hostal has had to say specifically about the continued allegations by those on the other side, directly from Hostal, Australia. The report is not accurate, as the comparison is not apples for apples. There are substantial differences which have been factored. Here are the detailed factors as per your request. CCBP 9 and 10, the contract was in 2017. Those are the Australian vessels. Therefore, changes in material cost and labor escalation, followed on an 8-boat order on an existing production line. So, of course, it depends on the already boats in stream and being built. That would reduce the cost. Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard's new contract with associated startup costs. There have been changes to specifications. For example, our radio system, they use Motorola. We use the Harris system in Trinidad and Tobago. Those are some of the changes that push the cost up. General arrangement unique to the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard drive considerable redesign costs, changes to equipment list, revised gen sets, changes to equipment list on the tactical communications, changes to make the model and numbers of the ship's boats, now 6 boats, and we've also entered into a maintenance and a spares program that is part of that whole cost. the compressed time frame, because we've asked for these vessels to be built and delivered by next year, 2020. All of these things have a cost item. So therefore, I reject completely and out of hand what has been suggested repeatedly by Senator Mark. I'd just like to end by this. There's been a lot of crying out in the population about fishermen. I have been very careful as the Minister of National Security when I call people fishermen. There have been a certain amount of kidnappings that have taken place, and I'll end by saying this. I am fairly certain that certainly on this side and the independent side, there's no one that would be able to raise even $5,000 in cash from a bank if they walked into a bank now. I believe this question for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. How could a fisherman raise $20,000 in cash overnight to pay a ransom? Furthermore, when these vessels were intercepted going out to fish, there was not a single hook, line, sinker in any of the vessels, nor any fish. I am very cautious about what I say, and I guarantee those in the Senate, as well as outside, with a lot of my recent utterances, including on a political platform last week, Friday, I have the evidence to substantiate everything I've said. We will continue to do the work that we're doing at national security. We will continue to go after the criminals in national security without fear or favor, and we will do so to the best of our ability. I give the assurance, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Seepersad.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the Appropriation Financial Year 2020 Bill 2019. Mr. Vice President, I am certain that we are all concerned about the well-being of all our citizens, the fortunate, the not so fortunate, the disadvantaged and downtrodden. The Finance Minister, therefore, would have endeavoured to present a package that, although not satisfying to all, is at least satisfying to the majority. Having listened to hours of debate and read volumes praising and condemning the Appropriation Bill 2019, I ask, how will the quality of life for all improve? Specifically, the quality of life that depends on the goods and services which are expected from the public utilities and public service departments. In the current global reality, governments need to address complex issues such as climate change, slowing economic growth, and increased destabilizing risks such as Brexit. The unifying theme is that technology is driving an increased rate of change, and the world is becoming more complicated and polarized. Many countries, both internationally and regionally, will have a brighter future if they can adapt to the demands of their citizens and consumers. However, for those countries who have not been able to respond appropriately, large sections of their populations will be left behind. Trinidad and Tobago will be impacted by these external shocks, and whilst there is still income from oil and gas, and diversification issues which are critical to the country's future are debated, we need to understand that technology is the future. The largest world economies, for example, China, are rapidly adopting robotics, artificial intelligence, and other digitally enabling technologies so that goods and services can be provided cheaper and faster. The primary focus of any administration is to consistently improve the quality of life for everyone in Trinidad and Tobago. To do this, we need to transform Trinidad and Tobago with our finite energy resources, inefficient and outdated systems, and inadequately trained personnel. The entire country needs to buy into this goal of transformation. We need to aggressively set out programs to train, retrain, and upskill our citizens so that they have the relevant skills for the future world. Information is transmitted instantaneously across the world, and Trinidad and Tobago citizens will continue to demand better services, better government, and greater transparency. We have seen the strength of social media in influencing the world stage of climate change, politics, and governments. Economic review. Trinidad and Tobago is a small open economy which depends mainly on exports from the energy sector to earn foreign exchange, to purchase food, medicines, and other necessities of life which we do not or cannot produce. The energy sector, oil, gas, and petrochemicals, account for 85% of the country's foreign exchange earnings and exports. This is the highest level of export concentration since 2011. The government's revenue depends on taxes from all sectors of the economy, especially the energy industry, over which it has limited or no control. Therefore, the government's role in the economy is reactive, modified only by its ability to save, spend counter-cyclically, borrow, and in the long term transform the economy. Government income has been less than expenditure for the past 10 years. This is partly a result of the dramatic fall in energy prices starting in 2014. Even though expenditure has decreased by an average of $10 billion since 2015, and it is commendable that the government has sought to control expenditure, nevertheless, budget deficits have continued. Further, the recent tax amnesty netted $2.38 billion in additional revenue. These deficits have been financed by borrowing. Gross public debt is $119.81 billion as of July 2019, and gross public debt, including contingent liabilities to GDP, is 75.3%, or $92,000 in public sector debt per person. Trinidad and Tobago's sovereign investor rating is one level above junk status according to Standard & Poor, and Moody has rated us at junk status. However, it is reported that Fitch Ratings has a better view of this benchmark. However, this information is not available publicly, so further analysis is not possible. Mr. Vice President, if Trinidad and Tobago does not balance the revenue-expenditure ratio, we will lose our ability to negotiate favorable terms for our borrowing, and the investor rating will continue to decline. While these ratings have not yet restricted Trinidad and Tobago's ability to borrow, it does increase the financing costs. This means that there are less funds available to finance much-needed development and diversification efforts. When there are both monetary and fiscal policy imbalances, a tipping point will eventually be reached, which will require significant adjustment in interest rates and/or exchange rates to return to equilibrium. Both measures will cause significant financial trauma for both the macro and microeconomic environments. To strengthen the Trinidad and Tobago economy, we must implement policies that support economic diversification, facilitate the development of the non-energy sector, eliminate deficit spending, eliminate corruption, improve general safety, implement modern international benchmarking standards for measurable and sustainable quality of life in health, water, environment, crime, electricity, and so on. Recommendations. 1. Development of a plan to reduce the fiscal deficit and rising debt. A situation analysis of external threats and opportunities and internal strengths and weaknesses, while necessary, must include a long-term strategic development plan complete with deliverables and a timeline. This plan should include the implementation of legislative fiscal rules such as debt rules, limit on the level of public debt as a percentage of GDP, budget balance rules, target for overall budget surplus or deficit. 2. Competitiveness and ease of doing business. Reforms must be implemented to significantly improve Trinidad and Tobago's competitiveness, which includes ease of doing business that would allow the private sector to invest and lead to economic growth and job creation so that there will be a reasonable level of local business activity, import substitution, and exports. Trinidad and Tobago is ranked 79th out of 144 countries in the 2019 Global Competitiveness Index report and 125th out of the 190 countries in the 2019 World Bank Ease of Doing Business report. To establish a more efficient business environment, public institutions must be overhauled. We need to be more proactive and predictable. We need more proactive and predictable systems and policies. Anyone who needs a permit for planning approval from the Town and Country Department, a WASA clearance certificate, a TNTEC clearance certificate, and work permits knows that navigating through the processes are tedious, time-consuming, debilitating, and discouraging. The system works, but to what end? 3, a plan to reduce the size of government and reliance on transfers and subsidies. This includes the divestment of state assets in a transparent and competitive way and public-private partnerships for major capital projects. 4, a plan to address the overvalued dollar. Currently, we have an overvalued currency that subsidizes imports and penalizes exports, resulting in the erosion of the country's competitiveness and foreign exchange reserves. 5, diversification strategy. To move Trinidad and Tobago away from an unsupportable dependence on hydrocarbons and to promote other economic activities such as alternative and renewable energy and the digital economy. Diversifying of the economy. Mr. Vice President, diversification of the economy is crucial to our medium and long-term economic survival and growth. The primary reasons for the lack of economic diversifications are: the energy sector, when buoyant, has always been there to provide the financial cushion which has molded the local investment sector that favors the non-tradable sector, that is, agents and distributors for foreign goods and services. The lack of understanding that to become globally competitive, entrepreneurs must create a differentiated product or service, including the ability to be disruptive on the world stage. The lack of institutions that provide the knowledge, ideas, innovations, finance, market development, and marketing. There have been some attempts at economic diversification by several governments. Their initiatives included building industrial parks to attract foreign investment, negative listing to encourage the private sector to undertake import substitution with the long objective of producing goods for exports, building point leases to offer the private sector local commodities to support downstream industries. Some areas of diversification include: 1, the digital economy. The impact of the global digital economy is a serious threat to Trinidad and Tobago's economic activity. Amazon, Netflix, Google, Twitter, Facebook, for example, are taking away media market share from businesses while having no local economic footprint. They drain foreign exchange without significant costs. They simply create digital platforms and provide connectivity among consumers and accrue wealth to the platform owners. This activity has provided platform owners with massive amounts of personal data on consumers, and with data mining, produce profiles for marketers. These digital platforms are designed to exploit world consumers via the internet. In Trinidad and Tobago, economic activity is about consumption and not about local wealth creation. The government should be concerned about how to get some of this wealth-generating activity from the digital economy by creating a global value chain which includes building platforms, devising a system to get taxes from these platforms locally, modernizing an amendment of the legislative framework as it pertains to e-commerce. 2, renewable energy. Mr. Vice President, switching to renewable energy generation in the medium to long term will reduce Trinidad and Tobago's reliance on imported fuel and demand for US dollars. Fuel imports in 2018 was US $1.76 billion, or 21% greater than the total amount of non-energy exports for the year. The economics of renewables are such that it is impossible for oil and natural gas to compete with it in the medium to long term. The oil industry is facing a severe threat to its business model from the renewable energy in tandem with the electric vehicles revolution. Within a few years, electric vehicles will be superior to gasoline-powered cars. Electric motors are more efficient than gasoline engines. Also, the prices of solar and wind power and battery prices are falling significantly, and it is projected to continue to decline in the coming years. It is projected that the only way gasoline cars can compete with renewable energy-powered vehicles by 2024 is if the price of oil were to drop to US $11 or US $12 per barrel. The total life cycle cost of owning an electric vehicle will be cheaper than that of owning a gasoline-fueled car. Already on our streets, we have a growing number of hybrid automobiles. Other environmental benefits include public health benefits of not breathing polluted air, not having huge oil spills, and not destroying a livable planet. 3, carbon dioxide and enhanced oil recovery. Trinidad and Tobago's long-term goals for energy generation, carbon dioxide, and energy usage should at least be carbon neutral. Therefore, we need to emit less carbon dioxide. We can significantly increase oil production and reduce our enormous carbon footprint by using the carbon dioxide being vented for enhanced oil recovery and thereby eliminating major carbon dioxide emissions. 4, alternative energy usage. Trinidad and Tobago ratified the Paris Agreement on Climate Change on February 22, 2018. Therefore, businesses must be actively encouraged to engage in green practices. Incentive for the use of green delivery vehicles. Mr. Vice President, to reduce...
Senator,
Oh, sorry.
might I just ask or inquire as to how long do you have again? I'm trying to gauge as to whether...
It was,
Go ahead.
when I timed it, it was 38 minutes. I don't know how many minutes I've done.
Okay, so honorable members, at this point in time, we will break for lunch and we will return at 2:06.